Welcome, traveller, to Victorian England, the era where steam engines roared, moral judgment floated through the air like coal dust, and lawmakers crafted rules with the enthusiasm of someone rearranging their entire house at 2 a.m. The good news, you survived the century. The bad news, Parliament had opinions, and oh, did they ever. They had opinions about your clothes, your voice, your curtains, your vegetables, and possibly even your thoughts if they could have figured out how to regulate those too. Hello, travellers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. This was a time when the British Empire was at its height, boasting global power, industrial progress, and an unwavering commitment to micromanaging absolutely everything. Victorian lawmakers looked at the chaotic, noisy, ever-changing world around them and came to one conclusion. People needed rules before society collapsed under the weight of improper umbrella usage. Because while the empire was expanding across continents, the real threat, according to those stern men in Parliament, was a civilian holding a hat slightly too big for comfort, or a passerby humming past a respectable hour. To understand why the laws became so bizarre, picture Victorian society as a nervous host preparing for an unexpected royal visit. Everything had to look orderly, controlled, respectable, even if behind the curtains, things were one stiff breeze away from disaster. The Industrial Revolution had thrown the country into chaos, cities bursting with newcomers, new technologies causing moral panic, public behaviour changing faster than Queen Victoria could raise an eyebrow. Lawmakers reacted the only way they knew how, by regulating both the problems and anything that vaguely resembled a problem. If something moved unpredictably, they regulated it. If it didn't move, they regulated that too, just in case it started. Victorian values revolved around respectability, which explains why lawmakers tried to legislate morality, as if it was something you could file with the county clerk. They believed society needed strict boundaries or else civilization would collapse, people would start wearing trousers too confidently, and the world would fall into anarchy. The Victorian fear wasn't just of crime. No, that would be too straightforward. They feared impropriety. They feared ungentlemanly conduct. They feared anything that seemed a little too fun, a little too expressive, or a little too loud. In short, they feared people behaving like people. Imagine walking through London in the 1800s. You're trying to mind your business when suddenly you're confronted with a list of rules longer than your shopping receipt. No loud noises past respectable hours, no suspiciously shaped vegetables at the market, no improper window displays, no garments that reveal too much ankle-related enthusiasm, no walking at a pace deemed inconsiderate for public streets. And heaven forbid you have the audacity to whistle past a constable. That could be classified as unnecessary merriment, a near-criminal offence in certain boroughs. You see, the Victorians believed society was always one poorly timed sneeze away from chaos. If someone sneezed too loudly, a horse might panic. If the horse panicked, a carriage could overturn. If the carriage overturned, marmalade jars could shatter. And if marmalade jars shattered, well, the entire social order was at risk. This butterfly effect of disaster justified an avalanche of laws dedicated to preventing hypothetical catastrophes that lived only in lawmakers' imaginations. Part of this obsession came from the Victorian love of classification. Everything had to fit into neat categories: social class, moral worth, appropriate behaviour. If they could have labelled the air molecules as approved or unapproved, they absolutely would have. Scientists were discovering new phenomena, cities were swelling with factory workers, and Victorians clung to their rule books like they were lifeboats on a moral Titanic. But another part, the funnier part, is that many laws weren't created for logical reasons at all. Some were the result of random local incidents blown wildly out of proportion. One person trips over a discarded umbrella handle in Brighton. Congratulations, you now have a citywide regulation on umbrella handling etiquette. A man whistles too joyfully near a magistrate's window. Say hello to the Anti-Rowdiness Ordinance of 1874. Victorians didn't just create laws, they created overcorrections. Then there were the laws shaped by the fear that Britain was losing its moral compass. Victorian writers constantly warned that society must remain upright, dignified, and serene, qualities that were apparently endangered by rogue pianos rolling into gardens, or citizens daring to express enthusiasm in public. Victorian lawmakers wanted to protect the nation from scandal, chaos, and anything visually confusing. They treated society like a delicate souffle. One loud noise and everything could collapse. But perhaps the most entertaining part of all this is how seriously Victorians took their absurd regulations. They weren't joking. These laws were crafted with the same gravity as actual political issues. They debated umbrella usage like it was foreign policy. They treated improper hat sizing like a national emergency. They approached public singing as if it were a biological threat. And yet, behind the absurdity, these laws reveal something very human. A society trying desperately to maintain control in a world spinning faster than anyone expected. Victorian England was walking a tightrope between progress and panic. Their laws were part of a larger attempt to impose order on a world bursting with noise, innovation, and the terrifying idea that people might start behaving unpredictably. So as we enter this saga of regulations, brace yourself. You're about to explore laws so strange, so oddly specific, and so spectacularly overthought that you'll wonder whether Victorian lawmakers were doing fine or doing very much the opposite. Either way, it's going to be a delightful parade of the bizarre, and this was only the warm-up act. If you have ever kissed someone goodbye at a train station and felt romantic, dramatic, or at least vaguely cinematic, congratulations, you would have been a full-blown public menace in Victorian England. In the 19th century, passionate farewells weren't just frowned upon. Oh no, they were treated like a threat to national stability. Because in the Victorian imagination, nothing was more dangerous than love, especially if it stood between a locomotive and its timetable. Victorians feared a 5-second kiss could derail an entire railway schedule. Literally. Station masters filed complaints. Policemen wagged fingers. Local newspapers published outraged pieces with titles like "Improper Displays at the Platform." And moral societies held meetings where they discussed the dangers of romantic chaos. The level of concern was such that one might assume kissing created black holes instead of slightly moist goodbyes. To understand this panic, you must picture the Victorian railway station, a place where industrial progress, social anxiety, and too many hats collided in a giant echoing building filled with steam, shouts, whistles, and the occasional goat someone insisted on transporting. These stations were the beating heart of modern England, fast, loud, and absolutely terrifying to anyone who still considered horse-drawn travel exciting enough. Add romance to this mix, and suddenly things became unbearable for the Victorian mind. Here was the fear, with trains running on strict, almost militaristic schedules. Any slowdown, even a few seconds, could spark delays, confusion, moral decay, and, in one newspaper's opinion, a cascading failure of national punctuality. Punctuality was a religion in Victorian society. Trains were the temples, station masters were the priests, and couples kissing on the platform were frankly heretics. To the Victorian observer, a kiss wasn't a small expression of affection, it was a catastrophic interruption. One couple blocks the platform for too long. Suddenly the passengers behind them can't move forward. Luggage piles up, lines form. Someone faints, usually a woman in a corset regretting life choices. A startled horse pulling a goods cart rears. A postboy drops a crate of letters. Steam fills the platform. The conductor mishears the signal, and somewhere in this chain reaction, tragedy strikes. The train departs 47 seconds late. And if that doesn't justify legislative intervention, what does? It didn't help that Victorian fears about emotions were already wildly exaggerated. Public affection was considered indecent, a slippery slope that could only lead to chaos, improper thoughts, and possibly spontaneous combustion. Victorians believed feelings should be expressed with firm handshakes, not lips. A kiss was practically an emotional explosion. Doing it in public? That was the equivalent of setting off fireworks in a crowded drawing room. The panic reached its peak as trains became faster and schedules tighter. The more the railway system evolved, the more pressure station masters felt to keep everything running with cold steel perfection. But then, right as efficiency peaked, couples began using stations as their favourite spot for dramatic parting scenes. Romance followed train schedules like it had bought a season ticket. Suddenly, any platform in Britain might contain a sobbing sweetheart clinging to someone's sleeve, a desperate lover insisting just one more moment, two people holding each other like one of them was boarding a ship to Mars, and a queue of horrified Victorians watching the whole thing unfold like it was a live public scandal. Cue the moral authorities. Committees were formed. Newspapers printed warnings. Pamphlets circulated with phrases like emotional disorder on the railways. One article even claimed that public affection caused crowd agitation, a very Victorian phrase meaning people got slightly annoyed but wrote dramatic letters about it. This annoyance soon evolved into proposed ordinances designed to restore dignity to the nation's platforms. The proposed rules varied by region, but they all had the same spirit. No lingering, no clinging, no melodramatic scenes, and absolutely no prolonged kissing. A quick peck? Debatable. Something more passionate? Not on Her Majesty's railways, thank you very much. In some stations, constables were instructed to discourage affectionate behaviour by walking up to couples and clearing their throats loudly. Imagine being shamed out of a kiss by a man with mutton chops and a serious expression. Train staff even complained that kissing caused bottlenecks that made it difficult for passengers to board quickly. They argued that railways should function like clockwork, a clock that absolutely did not have time for hormones. One conductor famously remarked in a newspaper interview that the nation cannot afford tardiness caused by sentimental entanglements. Harsh, but if you spent your life yelling all aboard, you'd probably hate romance too. Then there were the fainting episodes. Victorian women, constrained by corsets and social expectations, were known to swoon at the slightest provocation. Hot weather, sudden emotion, loud dull noises, or the overwhelming pressure of saying goodbye while balancing 3 layers of skirts. These dramatic collapses did not help the case for platform affection. A woman fainting during a passionate farewell wasn't romantic. It was a logistical nightmare requiring smelling salts, water, and at least 6 people panicking in different directions. The irony, of course, is that these anti-kissing efforts did absolutely nothing to stop kissing. If anything, they made platform smooching more appealing. After all, humans have a strange instinct. If you tell them they cannot kiss in a certain place, suddenly that place becomes the most desirable kissing location in the universe. Victorian couples became stealthy. They perfected the art of the lightning-fast goodbye. They embraced behind suitcases, ducked behind pillars, turned farewells into covert operations, and thus, Victorian England became a place where railways represented efficiency, progress, and the thrilling possibility of causing a minor national panic by locking lips at the wrong time. If you have ever been stuck behind a slow walker and felt your soul leave your body, congratulations. A Victorian policeman would have sympathised with you. Sort of. But if you're the type who barrels down the street like a caffeinated pigeon, well, a Victorian policeman would have lectured you. Because in the 19th century, taking a stroll wasn't just movement. It was a regulated public performance, a moral test, and apparently a fragile pillar holding up the British Empire. To Victorians, improper walking was practically a crime against civilization itself. And the best part? They acted on it. There were genuine warnings, lectures, and in some regions, fines for people who walked too slow, too fast, too aimlessly, too energetically, or too much like they weren't aware Queen Victoria could be watching at any moment. Victorian streets were already chaotic. There were horses, Carts, omnibuses, newspaper boys, hawkers, coal deliv, goats, because there were always goats, and the occasional person who decided sidewalks were optional. So lawmakers and city officials began to worry deeply about the dangers of bad walking technique, because in their view someone walking at the wrong speed wasn't just annoying, they were a threat to national safety. One newspaper writer dramatically referred to reckless walkers as a scourge upon proper urban order, which is a very Victorian way of saying, oh, this man is mildly inconvenient and I hate him, and to understand the roots of the issue, picture a Victorian sidewalk. It's narrow, uneven and busy. One wrong step could send you into a puddle of questionable liquid, which might be water or beer or possibly horse byproducts nobody wants to identify. Everybody was moving with different destinations, different levels of urgency, and different numbers of petticoats influencing their speed. That was enough chaos already. But then came the strollers, a type of pedestrian Victorian society feared almost as much as pickpockets. The strollers were people who wandered slowly, taking in the scenery, often forming clumps that blocked half the pavement. They were the Victorian equivalent of tourists who stop in the middle of the sidewalk to admire a lamppost. Worse still were the gawkers, people who slowed to inspect shop windows, random street corners, or gossip unfolding 3 doors down. If you were unlucky enough to walk behind these human obstacles, you learned patience, restraint, and the burning desire for legally granted shoulder checks. To combat these hazards, urban authorities took action. Policemen patrolled busy walkways issuing warnings like, "Move along smartly now," or "Don't obstruct the thoroughfare," or the more poetic, "Sir, you are impeding the Queen's good pavement." A person who walked too slowly might be solded for causing bottlenecks that disturbed the flow of respectable commerce. And yes, some officers handed out small fines for public obstruction, which is perhaps the most polite phrase ever used to mean "get out of the way." But slow walkers were only half the problem. Victorians also feared the menace of the speed walker, individuals who darted through the streets with reckless momentum, swinging their arms like they were trying to beat their personal best. These people moved with purpose, intensity, and the occasional disregard for human life. Newspapers referred to them as runners in disguise. Shopkeepers complained about customers knocked aside like Victorian bowling pins. One London commentary even described them as hazards of unacceptable velocity. Authorities labelled such individuals as dangerously brisk. Policemen frequently stopped them with the classic Victorian insult. "Sir, this is a thoroughfare, not a racecourse." They worried that a man walking too fast might bump into a fragile lady, sending her fainting dramatically into the gutter. Or worse, a collision might startle a horse, which would startle a cart driver, which would startle the price of produce for 3 markets. Victorian logic was nothing if not creative. Of course, the era had a moral angle too. Walking too slowly suggested idleness, which Victorians viewed as one small step away from moral collapse. A slow walker was suspicious, unemployed, unproductive, up to mischief, possibly reading subversive pamphlets with titles like "Anarchy for Beginners." Who knew? Meanwhile, walking too quickly suggested unruly energy, emotional instability, or overexertion, unbecoming of a gentleman. Victorians didn't trust people who moved with enthusiasm. It looked like they were either late for a heist or trying to impress someone. Nothing terrified them more than unpredictability. A pedestrian who suddenly stopped to tie their shoe could cause what one commentator called urban disarray. A person who zigzagged around foot traffic was basically committing a social misdemeanor. Even turning around abruptly could earn you a glare powerful enough to alter your life choices, but the highlight of Victorian walking culture was the instruction on how to walk properly. Etiquette books actually offered guidance. Detailed, exhausting guidance. One advised, "Walk with purpose but never haste, with dignity but never laxity." Another warned women that swaying too much was tempting impropriety, while walking too stiffly made one appear cold, mechanical and unladylike. Men were told to avoid swinging their arms too widely, lest they seem aggressively athletic, a deeply suspicious quality. These books also scolded people against stopping too suddenly, turning without warning or looking around too often, as these behaviours were ungentlemanly. Imagine trying to function under rules that basically banned being surprised by anything ever. Ultimately, Victorian walking laws and etiquette existed because the streets were sensory overload for a society that valued order above all else. They wanted sidewalks to run like finely tuned clockwork, every step predictable, measured, and morally approved. Unfortunately, humans don't walk like clockwork. They walk like humans. And so Victorian England became the birthplace of regulated strolling, a place where pedestrians lived in fear of moving either too much or too little, while policemen patrolled the streets like stern traffic conductors of human legs. If you think modern people get dramatic about umbrellas on public sidewalks, allow me to introduce you to Victorian England, the only society in history where opening an umbrella could spark legal debates, newspaper outrage, and at least one fist fight involving a startled bishop. In this era of stiff collars, moral rigidity, and endless drizzle, the humble umbrella wasn't just a tool, it was a weapon of mass inconvenience, and Parliament naturally felt obligated to regulate it before the population poked each other into extinction. Victorians loved order, they feared chaos, and few things generated more chaos than a London street during a downpour. Picture the scene. Hundreds of pedestrians rushing for cover under awnings, horse-drawn omnibuses splashing muddy water with the precision of a sniper, gentlemen shouting, ladies tripping over their skirts, vendors yelling about their soaked cabbages, and in the middle of it all, a battlefield of umbrellas. The problem began with early umbrella design. These weren't the feather-light compact modern umbrellas that break after a stiff breeze. Victorian umbrellas were heavy, metal-tipped, and constructed like small catapults. One forceful flick of the wrist could send water flying in all directions, crack someone's monocle, or impale an unsuspecting passerby. Policemen reported umbrella incidents with the same seriousness modern officers reserve for traffic collisions. One constable's report read, "A lady of respectable appearance, upon unfurling her parasol, struck a gentleman in the chin, resulting in immediate offence." Victorians operated in a world where immediate offence could mean a duel, a lawsuit, or at minimum, a strongly worded letter to the Times. Something had to be done. Enter umbrella laws. Local municipalities began issuing advisories, and in some cities actual ordinances, on how umbrellas should be handled in public spaces. The regulations varied, but the spirit was universal. For the love of Queen Victoria, learn how to open your umbrella like a civilized human. Authorities urged citizens to open umbrellas slowly, preferably away from crowds. Avoid wide-angled arcs, which could cause umbrella sweep injuries. Carry umbrellas upright, not sideways like cavalry swords. Refrain from shaking excess rainwater onto pedestrians or horses. Ensure umbrella points remained near the owner's head, not at throat level of strangers. The last rule was crucial. Umbrella points were often made of metal, and Victorians walked close together in narrow spaces. A gentleman turning to greet a friend could accidentally stab a duchess in the shoulder. A lady bowing politely could nearly lose an eye. Newspaper humorists joked that umbrellas were the most democratic weapon in England, because anyone could injure anyone with complete equality. And if you think the upper classes were exempt from this chaos, rest assured, they were not. Aristocratic umbrellas were larger, heavier and more extravagant. One duchess famously carried a custom-made umbrella with a handle carved to resemble a Greek goddess. It was stunning, it was beautiful, and it nearly took out a cabinet minister's ear during a crowded carriage procession. The resulting scandal prompted a London paper to publish the headline, "The Dangers of Aristocratic Rain Gear." There were even debates about umbrella size. Policemen were encouraged to lecture citizens carrying umbrellas immoderately large for the pavement, a phrase that basically translates to, "Sir, your umbrella is too enormous and you are a menace." Some umbrellas were so wide they might as well have been portable canopies. A pedestrian walking with one could block half a street, 3 smaller pedestrians, and at least one dog. But the peak of the umbrella regulation came from fears of improper umbrella conduct near carriages. A sudden umbrella opening could spook a horse, and Victorian horses were known for having emotional states roughly equivalent to opera singers. One unexpected movement and they went straight into dramatic crisis mode. Countless carriage accidents were blamed on reckless umbrella usage. One magistrate claimed umbrellas were responsible for more startle-related mishaps than thunderstorms. Etiquette manuals joined the crusade, because nothing delighted Victorian authors more than turning everyday behaviour into a moral sermon. They printed instructions on how to grip an umbrella, not too tightly lest you appear anxious, how to carry it indoors, closed for dignity, and how to navigate a crowd with discretion and minimal flailing. Some manuals even insisted umbrellas should match the owner's social rank, outfit, and emotional state. Apparently, the wrong umbrella could cause fashion-based embarrassment, which in Victorian society was a fate nearly worse than death. The most entertaining rule of all, however, involved not poking nobility. It wasn't written down, but it was universally understood. If you jabbed an aristocrat with your umbrella, intentionally or not, it could spark scandal, ruin reputations, and unleash enough gossip to power a small city. Newspapers published cautionary tales. A young clerk who brushed against a countess's gown with his umbrella tip and then spent 3 months apologising. A governess who accidentally tapped a viscount's hat and nearly lost her job because the family feared umbrella contamination. And yet, despite all the panic warnings and etiquette rules, umbrellas remained a public hazard. They were clumsy, unpredictable, wind-sensitive instruments of doom, and Victorians absolutely loved them. They marched through storms with umbrella in hand, confident they were battling nature with honour, dignity, and only occasional property damage. In the end, the umbrella laws weren't just practical attempts at safety. They were a glimpse into the Victorian soul, a society desperate to impose order on chaos, even when that chaos was a piece of rain gear flapping violently in the wind. Where modern people see an umbrella, Victorians saw a public responsibility, a moral challenge, and potentially a lawsuit waiting to happen. Victorians feared many things: spontaneous dancing, poorly ironed curtains, women who read novels too quickly, but nothing terrified them quite like the idea of someone taking a bath at the wrong time of day. In an era bursting with anxieties about morality, hygiene, social order, and the general fragility of the human soul, bathing was seen as a delicate ritual that required strict supervision, and so naturally it was regulated with the intensity of a national security protocol. To understand this, you must first accept a simple truth. Victorian England did not view bathing the way we do. Today, taking a shower is a normal human activity. In the 19th century, it was equal parts medical treatment, moral cleansing, spiritual reset, and potential medical emergency. Victorians believed that water, especially hot water, could alter your internal balance, disrupt your humours, weaken your constitution, or tempt you into improper levels of comfort. So the idea of bathing whenever you wanted? Absolutely not. People unrestrained by the proper bathing schedules were one step away from unrestrained thoughts. Thus emerged a network of rules, guidelines, and whispered warnings governing when, where, and how a respectable person could wash themselves without accidentally summoning illness, scandal, or social collapse. Let us begin with public bathhouses, which became popular during the mid-1800s as cities tried to deal with poor sanitation. These bathhouses were regulated so precisely that visiting one felt less like cleaning yourself and more like participating in a government-approved cleanliness ceremony. Hours were announced, posted, and enforced with the same seriousness as train schedules. Morning hours were reserved for labourers who needed a quick wash before work. Afternoon hours catered to the middling sort, especially clerks, shop assistants, bookkeepers, and anyone who needed to keep their hair moderately respectable. Evening hours, depending on the neighbourhood, were either restricted entirely or designated for the robust, a polite phrase meaning people who could withstand the scandal of washing at night. Why restrict evening baths? Because Victorians believed bathing late in the day posed a danger to the body. Warm water opened pores, softened the skin, and, according to some medical pamphlets, made the human body far too receptive to night breezes, sinful impulses, and melancholic vapours. One doctor gravely warned that post-sunset baths could cause diminished vigour in men and emotional instability in women, proving that Victorian medicine was 95% imagination and 5% soap. Of course, gender segregation in bathhouses was non-negotiable. Men and women could not bathe anywhere near each other, even if separated by walls, curtains, furniture, or an entire floor. Some bathhouses alternated days, Mondays, Wednesdays and Fridays for men, Tuesdays, Thursdays, Saturdays for women, and Sunday closed for moral contemplation. Others divided time slots so narrowly that a man bathing 10 minutes too late might find himself violating a moral ordinance, committing an accident of timing that Victorian society would remember forever. Then came the temperature rules. Many bathhouses and private homes had restrictions on how hot water could be. Scalding water, they believed, caused nervous agitation, poor digestion, and rebellious thoughts. Cold water, on the other hand, was considered dangerously invigorating, capable of waking primal instincts. One article in a domestic advice book warned that water too warm or too cool may generate restlessness, which is perhaps the most Victorian sentence imaginable. In some boroughs, local ordinances even discouraged boiling water for baths after certain hours, insisting that neighbours were disturbed by the sound of kettles. Whether people truly feared kettles or simply disliked their neighbours is still up for debate. But the strangest rules came from private homes and boarding houses, where landlords issued strict bathing schedules to maintain order, and to conserve water, which was expensive and labour-intensive to heat. Tenants could find notices such as bathing permitted only between 6 and 7 a.m, no baths after dusk. Water heated upon request. Request must be submitted 3 hours prior. 10 minutes only, lest the boiler be exhausted. One London boarding house rule specifically stated, tenants must not bathe excessively meaning more than twice per week. Excessive bathing, the owner feared, could weaken moral character or simply raise the utility bill. Victorian logic was flexible. Some families viewed bathing as a luxury so intimate and personal it bordered on morally questionable. Bathing at unconventional times, especially at night, was considered suspicious. Why would anyone bathe so late unless they were hiding something? Many parents scolded children for attempting reckless evening washing, believing it could lead to colds, madness, or premature adulthood. And then there were the municipal bathing laws, which attempted to regulate outdoor bathing, particularly in rivers, lakes, and city canals. People weren't allowed to bathe outdoors during daylight hours unless fully clothed, a contradiction that Victorians seemed comfortable with. Authorities worried that respectable women might accidentally see a bare elbow, setting off a moral crisis from which no neighbourhood could recover. Some towns banned outdoor bathing except at dawn, when only the bravest souls and the local ducks were awake. At the heart of all this regulation was an unspoken truth. Victorian society loved predictability. Bathing, with its improv-like spontaneity, water splashing unpredictably, and potential for unseemly relaxation, felt like a rebellious act unless tightly controlled. They weren't terrified of bathing itself, they were terrified of bathing freely. Because if people could wash whenever they wanted, what next? Laugh whenever they wanted, eat without consulting etiquette guides, wear fewer than 12 layers of clothing? No. Victorian England survived on boundaries, timetables, and the public understanding that everything, even bathing, must occur in its proper place, at its proper time, under the watchful gaze of propriety. Victorian England was a world of strict protocols, neatly trimmed morals, and an absolutely chaotic relationship with facial hair. Few things reveal the era's personality quite like the intense, borderline obsessive rules about who could grow a beard, who absolutely could not, and why every whisker carried social, medical, and sometimes political meaning. Because while Victorians tolerated industrial haze, overcrowded cities, and streets where mystery puddles were a daily hazard, the one thing they struggled to navigate was the beard, that stubborn, growing, and occasionally philosophical creature attached to a man's face. In the early Victorian period, clean-shaven faces dominated professional life. A smooth chin suggested discipline, restraint, and the ability to resist the primal temptation to sprout hair like a wild creature. Men without beards were considered tidy, reliable, and possessed of the type of moral fibre that could hold together a proper empire. Clergymen, doctors, and bankers were expected to maintain faces so smooth they could reflect candlelight, or else risk whispers about their character. But by mid-century, the social winds shifted dramatically. Beards surged into fashion like a hairy revolution. Suddenly, hairless chins seemed unmanly. Newspapers insisted beards signalled virility, bravery, and the kind of physical constitution necessary to survive industrial Britain's air quality. Doctors even claimed beards functioned as natural air filters, because nothing says scientific progress, like believing your mustache is a medical device. This pendulum swing created one of the most uniquely Victorian problems imaginable. Entire professions now had to reconsider their faces. Policemen, for example, were once encouraged to remain clean-shaven for public approachability. But then came the era when police officers were required to grow moustaches, not optional required. Officers with bare lips were considered insufficiently authoritative, which is a polite British way of saying, you look too friendly and people might not fear you enough. For decades, not having a moustache could jeopardise a man's position on the force. Imagine showing up to work and being told, sorry Jenkins, but without adequate whisker density, we can't have you representing the nation's justice system. Meanwhile, in other professions, beards were considered deeply inappropriate. Accountants, clerks, and postal workers were discouraged from growing anything more dramatic than polite sideburns. Beards suggested rebellion, nonconformity, or, worst of all, artistic tendencies. You couldn't balance the Empire's books while looking like a romantic poet. Appearances mattered. A beard on a clerk was like wearing emotional honesty on your chin, and Victorian officers simply could not risk that. Victorian barbers, sensing economic opportunity, and perhaps a chance to stir societal chaos, fed into this confusion. Pamphlets circulated claiming certain beard shapes were linked to specific virtues. The imperial beard suggested leadership. The full British implied boldness. The chin curtain suggested industriousness, or, depending on who you asked, the aesthetic preferences of someone who lived too close to a knitting factory. Meanwhile, the mutton chop sideburns had the unfortunate reputation of making a man look either aristocratic or inexplicably startled. Then there were the elaborate grooming rules. Beards had to be shaped a certain way for funerals, tucked neatly for dinner parties, oiled for business meetings, and occasionally positioned so they wouldn't frighten children. Yes, really, Victorian parenting advice often included warnings that overly wild facial hair could prompt nightmares in sensitive youngsters. No one wanted their child waking up screaming about a rogue whisker beast. But perhaps the strangest part of Victorian beard culture was the swirling rumour of a moustache tax, a concept so perfectly Victorian that even though it wasn't formally enacted, everyone believed it could have been. The idea spread through newspapers and coffee houses. The government, in its never-ending need to regulate everything, might soon require men to pay an annual fee for their moustaches. Some joked it would be assessed by length, others by curl quality, others by moral neatness. Panic ensued. Men wondered if they could afford their chin identities. Debates broke out. Letters were written to editors. Politicians were asked to clarify their moustache positions. It was the closest Britain ever came to a whisker-based uprising. Of course, the deeper reason behind beard regulations was moral anxiety. Victorians feared that too much hair signified too much freedom. The beard revival was associated with soldiers returning triumphant from colonial campaigns, philosophers challenging social norms, and medical experts insisting men should breathe through a protective facial air filter. Meanwhile, strict workplaces feared that beards gave men too much personality. Personality in Victorian England was dangerous unless carefully supervised. Women, for their part, had strong opinions too. Etiquette books offered guidance like, "A lady should avoid a man whose facial hair obscures entirely the features of his countenance," and "Beards may offer protection in cold seasons but render summer courtship impractical." Some women adored magnificent beards, others feared they contained secrets, crumbs, or worse, political opinions. The military also had complex rules. The British Army allowed moustaches but long frowned upon the full beards unless stationed in exceptionally cold climates or remote locations. The logic was simple. A moustache conveyed discipline. A full beard conveyed frontier energy, which was only acceptable if one was fighting wolves or snowstorms. By late Victorian times, facial hair had become its own battlefield of identity, class symbolism, professionalism, masculinity, colonial ideology, medical pseudoscience, and occasionally fashion catastrophe. A beard could elevate a man, ruin him, define him, or confuse absolutely everyone around him. What makes the era's beard regulations so delightful is how much energy society devoted to them. Laws weren't always formal statutes, but many were enforced socially, professionally, or institutionally with the same seriousness as actual legislation. The question, should a man grow a beard, wasn't simple. It was a public debate, a professional dilemma, and in some households a family argument. In the end, Victorian England's beard obsession reveals what the era did best. Take something ordinary, harmless, and biologically inevitable, and turn it into a moral crisis requiring public commentary. Victorian society was built on contradictions. They wanted progress but feared change. They loved rules but bent them constantly. And they insisted women should be delicate while simultaneously binding them in garments that made breathing a competitive sport. Nowhere is this glorious contradiction more obvious than in the era's bizarre, ambitious, utterly doomed attempts to regulate corset use, attempts so ineffective they may as well have been written on a strongly worded teacup. Corsets were not merely undergarments in Victorian England. They were social expectations, architectural feats, and occasionally medical emergencies wrapped in satin. To many women, the corset was a badge of respectability. To many men, it was proof women were capable of surviving conditions normally reserved for submarines. To Victorian lawmakers, it was a crisis waiting to happen, and one they were convinced they could solve with moral committees, lectures, and rules nobody took seriously. The problem, according to reformers, was corset abuse. This phrase suggests women were violently attacking people with corsets, but no, they were merely wearing them with too much enthusiasm. Certain towns created committees dedicated to fighting the epidemic of tight lacing, a trend in which women pulled their corsets so tight that their waists shrank dramatically, and their ability to remain conscious became at best theoretical. These committees released pamphlets warning that the excessive corseting could cause headaches, organ displacement, poor digestion, moral decay, and an alarming tendency to swoon during dramatic moments. Unfortunately for them, Victorian society loved dramatic moments. Swooning practically counted as cardio for upper-class women. So instead of reducing fainting, the anti-corset crackdown made fainting culture even more spectacular. Reformers insisted corsets were a health hazard, but they didn't anticipate Victorian logic. If the moral authorities told women not to do something, many immediately suspected they were missing out on something exciting. This created a cultural stalemate. Committees insisted for moral purity. Fashion magazines insisted for aesthetic triumph. Women insisted on being able to walk into a room looking like they had successfully turned their ribcage into a fashionable storage unit. Local leaders tried to enforce their anti-corset crusades through ordinances. Some towns discouraged extreme tight lacing in public. Others posted warnings in dressmaker shops. One particularly dramatic city council even attempted to ban the sale of lacing strings over a certain length, as if shorter strings meant shorter collapses. It didn't help that the crackdown coincided with the height of corset innovation. New materials like whalebone allowed corsets to be stronger than ever, meaning women could reach waist sizes previously considered mythological. The committee's greatest frustration was that corsets weren't just fashion, they were symbols of status, discipline, and moral fortitude. A well-laced woman was considered well-behaved. A loosely laced woman, questionable, possibly rebellious. Maybe, brace yourself, modern. The corset was a visual guarantee of societal conformity. Asking Victorians to abandon it was like suggesting everyone suddenly stop caring about reputation. No amount of anti-corset propaganda could compete with the power of social judgment. And then there were the fainting couches, elegant cushioned monuments to the era's commitment to collapsing gracefully. Instead of reducing their use, anti-corset campaigns led to more fainting, more swooning, and more melodrama than ever. Because when corseting became a public debate, women tightened their stays out of pride. Reformers blamed corsets for fainting. Women blamed reformers for worrying too much. The result? A century of living rooms filled with women going down like dominoes at the slightest inconvenience. Of course, fainting itself wasn't always caused by corsets. Sometimes women fainted because they were overheated, overwhelmed, underfed, or bored to death by long conversations about wallpaper. But corsets were the most convenient scapegoat, and committees treated them like demonic inventions designed to test the limits of human lung capacity. Medical professionals chimed in too, though their advice was alarmingly inconsistent. Some insisted tight lacing was dangerous, others claimed it supported the female frame. One doctor wrote a long article warning that corsets could disrupt digestion, then ended by saying they impart elegant posture when worn judiciously. Victorian medicine was essentially guesswork with good penmanship. Anti-corset activists tried appealing to reason. When that failed, they appealed to guilt. When that failed, they decorated pamphlets with terrifying illustrations of squished internal organs. Women responded by buying corsets with even more reinforcement. The battle was lost. Perhaps the funniest part of all this is that while reformers yelled about fainting, society treated fainting as entertainment. Balls, church services, and afternoon teas were all improved, in their eyes, by a dramatic swoon. A fainting woman provided spectacle, drama, and an excuse for nearby men to pretend they knew first aid. Why eliminate something that made social gatherings more interesting? There was also the paradoxical belief that a corseted woman looked fragile and helpless, qualities Victorians admired in their ideal feminine archetype. But removing the corset would suddenly make women bold and unmanageable. Reformers promised freedom, society feared chaos, and so corsets remained firmly cinched. Despite the efforts of committees, reformers, moral crusaders, doctors, pamphleteers, and angry city councils, the anti-corset movement failed spectacularly. The rules were ignored, mocked, or weaponized as arguments for tighter fashion. In the end, corsets outlived most of their critics. Many Victorian women were buried in them by choice. The entire fiasco reveals something essential about Victorian England. If you tried to legislate behaviour that also served as a fashion statement, a social requirement, and a public performance, you were destined to fail. The anti-corset laws were noble in theory, ridiculous in practice, and wonderfully entertaining in hindsight. Victorian England had a complicated relationship with noise. They loved loud parades, loud sermons, loud factory whistles, and loud moral outrage. But when it came to night time, they demanded silence so pure it could be bottled and sold as a luxury tonic. Victorian lawmakers feared many things, but few terrified them quite like the prospect of someone bursting into song after 10 p.m. Victorians didn't need Spotify, they needed silence. Firm, disciplined, state-sanctioned silence. By mid-century, many towns across Britain passed ordinances banning singing, humming, shouting, playing instruments, or emitting any sound that suggested a person was enjoying themselves within earshot of sleeping citizens. The reasoning was simple. Nighttime noise was believed capable of causing illness, moral decline and, worst of all, annoyance. And if there was one thing Victorian society could not endure, it was being annoyed. To grasp the issue, you must imagine a Victorian street at night. Lamps flicker, the occasional carriage rattles by, cats fight like furry gladiators. Somewhere a man coughs because everyone in the 19th century coughed constantly. Silence was rare, fragile, and deeply coveted. Unfortunately, humans enjoy singing, whistling, laughing, and generally existing, and these habits had the audacity to persist after sundown. Local authorities responded with legislation. Ordinances were posted in taverns, boarding houses, and public squares. No singing after 10 p.m, no whistling after 10 p.m, no musical instruments after 10 p.m, no loud exclamations, emotional outbursts, or raucous behaviour. One town even banned vigorous laughter, which raises the question: what qualifies as non-vigorous laughter? A polite puff of air? A smile so small it barely counts? The laws were enforced by night constables, men who patrolled streets listening for any sign of improper nighttime cheer. These officers took their job seriously. A constable hearing someone hum a tune was expected to intervene like he'd caught a highwayman. The offender was often issued a warning, a lecture, or, in recalcitrant cases, a fine for disturbing public peace through disruptive vocal expression. Not all offenders were rowdy youths or drunken revellers. Many were ordinary people who forgot themselves for one dangerous, melodic moment. A maid returning home from work, whistling to keep herself awake. A sailor on shore leave humming a sea shanty. A baker testing his singing voice while kneading dough before dawn. All were potential threats to Victorian nocturnal harmony. The biggest offenders, however, were musicians. The 19th century was full of amateur violinists, accordion players, penny whistlers, and men who purchased a flute believing talent came included. These individuals enjoyed practicing at odd hours, unleashing unpolished symphonies upon neighbourhoods that wanted nothing more than blessed quiet. Newspapers printed letters from exhausted citizens begging the government to do something about night fiddlers, a phrase that now sounds like a minor villain group in a children's fantasy novel. Taverns were hotspots of trouble. Many pubs featured sing-alongs where patrons belted out songs fueled by camaraderie and cheap ale. These performances became louder as the night progressed. At exactly 10 p.m, pub owners were legally obliged to shut down music, shush customers, and transform the establishment from a roaring chorus hall into a monastery, a transition that rarely happened smoothly. Constables were often summoned to stand outside pubs, arms folded, radiating disapproval at anyone whose voice rose above a whisper. Part of the obsession stemmed from Victorian medical beliefs. Doctors warned that nighttime noise disturbed rest in ways that could lead to fatigue, weaken nerves, digestive trouble, or general moral feebleness, a diagnosis that roughly translates to being grumpy. Sleep, they believed, was a delicate, almost sacred condition. Once interrupted, it could unleash a chain reaction of ailments that would require immediate attention from a man holding a stethoscope and far too much confidence. Another concern involved property values. Wealthier neighbourhoods pushed for stricter sound ordinances, claiming noise lowered the dignity of a district. A single man singing outside at 11 p.m. could devalue a row of homes, or so some homeowners insisted while clutching their mortgages like fragile heirlooms. Silence became a status symbol. The quieter the street, the more respectable its residents. Evening quiet was essentially the Victorian version of gated community rules. Rigid, exclusive, and enforced with passive-aggressive enthusiasm. Of course, not everyone obeyed. Young people in particular found joy in pushing the limits. Groups of teenage boys would sneak through alleys singing folk tunes, earning the wrath of neighbours who opened their windows and shouted threats involving brooms. Sailors, soldiers, and factory workers coming off long shifts were notorious for belting out songs as they walked home. Their voices echoed through the streets like rebellious sound waves defying the empire. Occasionally, entire communities coordinated anti-noise crackdowns. Town councils published pamphlets titled things like "On the Preservation of Nightly Stillness," full of moral warnings, diagrams of proper nighttime comportment, and the assertion that respectable citizens must retire quietly like lanterns being gently extinguished. It sounded poetic, but it mostly meant please shut up. Ironically, the stricter the rules became, the more fervently some people clung to nighttime singing as a form of small, delightful rebellion. Humans have always enjoyed doing things they're told not to. Tell them they can't sing after 10 p.m, and suddenly they're writing harmonies. One London neighbourhood became famous for silent singing, where people mouthed words dramatically without sound boards, essentially miming an emotional rock concert no one could hear. The ordinances reveal something charmingly Victorian, a society trying to impose order on human nature through sheer determination. They believed nighttime peace was so important they were willing to legislate humming. And in doing so, they transformed simple sounds into criminal acts and night constables into guardians of acoustic purity. In the end, the no singing after 10 p.m. rules weren't just laws. They were a portrait of a society both deeply anxious and endlessly earnest, a society convinced that noise, like everything else, required moral supervision. Victorian England was a place where even your windows had reputations to uphold. While today we hang whatever we like, plants, fairy lights, questionable holiday decorations, Victorians treated windows like miniature public stages. Every curtain, every object, every glimpse into the home was a moral proclamation, and because Victorians never missed an opportunity to turn anxiety into legislation, strict rules emerged about what you could hang, show, or accidentally reveal in your windows. Yes, even your curtains had moral responsibilities. To understand this phenomenon, imagine walking down a Victorian street. Rows of houses pressed shoulder to shoulder like they were gossiping about one another. Windows were everywhere, tall, narrow, prim, and always watching. In a society obsessed with reputation, these windows functioned as the eyes of the neighbourhood. What you displayed in them wasn't mere decoration, it was an announcement of status, virtue, tidiness, and whether or not your household was sliding into moral anarchy. Victorian lawmakers and local councils, apparently worried that citizens might one day express themselves too freely, introduced a tangle of regulations governing window displays. Some were official ordinances, others were deeply enforced social rules disguised as community expectations. Either way, people were monitored, formally or informally, for what appeared behind glass. Curtains were the first battleground. They weren't just cloth, they were moral armour. A respectable family used curtains to signal privacy and dignity, but curtains that were too thin, scandalous, too thick, suspicious, too colourful, a sign of flamboyant tastes and questionable priorities. One etiquette book warned that a careless drape suggests a careless mind, which feels like an uncomfortably direct attack on anyone who has ever hung curtains in a hurry. Some towns even had municipal guidelines about curtain colour. Light fabrics were preferred because they looked clean and didn't make the home appear closed off from society. Dark curtains, meanwhile, became associated with secretive personalities, dubious activities, or, worst of all, a household that might not invite the neighbours to tea. In certain communities, constables were instructed to intervene if curtains were hung incorrectly, left crooked, or displayed unbecoming patterns. In one famous case, a man was formally reprimanded because his curtains were aggressively floral. Victorian paperwork could be so wonderfully petty. But curtains were only the beginning. Laws evolved to address what objects could be placed in windows. There was a genuine fear that improper displays might corrupt passers-by, particularly impressionable women, children, and those fragile men who fainted at the sight of eccentric decor. Authorities and moral societies targeted brightly painted ornaments, too gaudy, foreign curiosities, too exotic, possibly French, which made them worse. Books facing outward, someone might read the title and have thoughts. Figurines considered overly whimsical. Whimsical was not a compliment in the 19th century. plants associated with superstition, especially ferns, which Victorian critics believed were encouraging hysteria. Even innocent items could spark scandal. A porcelain shepherdess figurine once caused an uproar in Bath when a nosy neighbour claimed it was suggestively positioned, prompting a week-long debate about whether inanimate objects could be immoral. Verdict: yes, if someone disapproved loudly enough. Storefronts were regulated even more aggressively. Shops were required to follow rules about how many items could be placed in each window, how spaced out they must be, and how reflective the glass was allowed to be. Too cluttered, and authorities called it visual confusion. Too sparse, and critics claimed it looked melancholic. Too shiny, and it risked blinding carriage horses, which was, apparently, a weekly concern for everyone. But the crown jewel of absurdity was the crackdown on interior exposure. No, not people, not scandalous activities, furniture. Victorians were horrified by the idea that a passerby might glimpse part of a home's interior. Seeing a dining chair or corner table through a window was practically a violation of public decency. Some cities issued warnings stating that households must ensure no private domestic arrangements should be plainly visible from the public street. A visible armchair could trigger gossip that your family did not understand the concept of modesty. This obsession made cleaning windows a strategic operation. If you pulled back the curtains too far while scrubbing the glass, pedestrians might see your wallpaper pattern, leading to rumours that your family had modern tendencies or was overly fond of floral motifs. In Victorian England, floral wallpaper conveyed things, none of which were neutral. The paranoia grew worse at night. Window lighting was supervised with the same paranoia Victorians usually reserved for dance halls and fainting episodes. Households were instructed not to let lamp silhouettes cast revealing shadows through curtains. The fear wasn't of nudity, though that certainly caused its own panics, but of neighbours discovering your chaise longue wasn't aligned with the carpet or realising your bookshelf had more novels than dictionaries. Imagine living in a world where reading material was treated like a personality leak. Some neighbourhoods formed window committees, groups of middle-class citizens who walked the streets, inspecting windows like overzealous interior police. Members reported offences such as curtains too shabby, curtains too new, showing off perhaps, improper valance angles, dust visible on the sill, objectionable arrangement of knickknacks. One committee famously issued a public reminder that a window is not a theatre and the home is not a stage for performative domesticity. Ironically, this statement itself was extremely performative, and rebellions did occur. A few brave souls deliberately hung loud, gaudy curtains, painted their window frames unconventional colours, or displayed quirky figurines as acts of quiet resistance. These renegades were whispered about with the same scandalised energy usually reserved for affairs or political radicalism. Yet their windows became local attractions, much like early art installations, only with far more emotional investment. In the end, Victorian window laws and expectations reveal a society with an Olympic-level commitment to policing appearances. The outside world wasn't supposed to know who you really were, only who you pretended to be. To Victorians, windows weren't openings, they were declarations, and heaven help you if your declaration involved mismatched drapes. Victorian England had many fears: germs, moral decline, spontaneous fainting, overly decorative vegetables, but few anxieties ran deeper than the dread of a man wearing trousers that revealed too much enthusiasm for life. In an age where everything from umbrella usage to nighttime humming was legislated, men's trousers were no exception, and so began one of the strangest, most unintentionally hilarious crusades of the Victorian era, the fight to regulate male tightness, of trousers, that is. To understand why this became a national concern, you must picture the Victorian gentleman, upright, polished, polite, a human lamppost of moral restraint. The ideal Victorian man was a creature of subtle gestures, carefully suppressed feelings, and trousers that conveyed absolutely nothing except, "I exist and I am going to a meeting." Anything beyond that, any suggestion of flamboyance, physical vitality, or outline, was considered deeply inappropriate for public viewing. Enter the trousers panic. As tailoring advanced and fabrics improved, younger men began embracing tighter fits. Some did it for fashion. Some did it to show they took fencing or rowing seriously. Some did it because humans, in general, enjoy looking good. Unfortunately, Victorian society reacted to these evolving fashions with the same level of alarm reserved for small crimes or large fires. Critics accused tight trousers of causing moral decay, dangerous vanity, the weakening of masculine character, unwholesome curiosity among onlookers, potential traffic hazards, because apparently trousers could distract horses. Newspapers wrote scathing editorials, church leaders scolded congregations, and local lawmakers decided something must be done before England lost its dignity to a generation of well-fitted pants. Thus emerged rules, warnings, and in some cities, actual ordinances, attempting to define how tight a gentleman's trousers could be before society imploded. These rules came in several categories. 1. No trousers shall describe the form too clearly. This was the cornerstone of Victorian trouser policy. Tailors were expected to ensure trousers hung straight, with a modest drape, and with no risk of revealing the architecture of the leg. Any garment that clung too proudly to the thigh, calf, or other areas was condemned for immodest emphasis. One etiquette guide warned young men that a gentleman does not display the geography of his limbs, as though thus the average citizen might collapse at the sight of a well-defined kneecap. 2. Avoid trousers that inspire undue attention. Victorians believed fashion should be admired, but only from a respectful emotional distance. Tight trousers, however, invited stares. Stares invited thoughts. Thoughts invited sin. And sin, according to Victorian logic, invited social collapse. The phrase inspiring undue attention appeared frequently in local regulations. Exactly what level of attention was considered due remained conveniently vague. 3. The danger of stretchy materials. Tailors experimenting with new fabrics faced accusations of contributing to moral downfall. Some councils even issued warnings advising merchants against selling overly flexible materials, lest men take advantage of this elasticity. Elasticity, one critic wrote, encourages men to move with inappropriate confidence, which frankly sounds like the greatest product endorsement of all time. 4. Warnings against shocking silhouettes. Victorian silhouettes were supposed to be gently hinted at, not boldly announced. Tight trousers created outlines. Outlines created panic. Women's fashion during the era may have included corsets tight enough to challenge physiology, but apparently the sight of a man's leg shape was where society drew the line. One magistrate reportedly lectured a young man for wearing trousers that declared, rather than suggested, the existence of legs. 5. Trouser length and the horror of ankles. Victorian ankles had a complicated reputation. Female ankles were practically mythological objects censored by society. Male ankles, while less scandalous, were nonetheless expected to remain subdued. Tight trousers posed a serious risk. When a man sat down or bent over, the trousers might ride up, revealing an indecent amount of socks, or worse, actual skin. In some areas, tailors were encouraged to leave extra length to prevent accidental display. The enforcement, yes, there was enforcement. Local officers didn't measure trouser tightness with calipers or anything, though it feels like something Victorians would have invented. But they did issue warnings. A constable could stop a gentleman and say something like, "Sir, those garments are excessively fitted for public decorum." Men who ignored warnings risked fines for indecent attire or moral provocation. Tailors, too, were occasionally fined or lectured for destabilizing public modesty. Imagine being punished because your tailor did too good a job. The cultural backlash, the trouser rebellion. Naturally, young men rebelled. Fashion-forward Victorians took pride in precisely the tightness society tried to ban. Some turned it into a symbol of defiance, wearing trousers that could be described as optimistic at best, reckless at worst. These rebels strutted through the streets with confidence, forcing polite society to confront something they feared even more than improper clothing, men enjoying fashion. Victorians didn't know how to process that. The great hypocrisy. Here's the delicious irony. While society condemned tight trousers, they absolutely adored military uniforms, which were often just as fitted. Soldiers in dress trousers showed more leg definition than your average opera tenor. But that was acceptable because uniforms symbolized duty, discipline, and empire. Fashion was dangerous. Patriotism, completely different story. This double standard confused everyone, especially young men who wanted to look heroic without enlisting. In the end, the laws failed because trousers are powerful, despite warnings, pamphlets, moral concerns, and stern glances from elderly relatives. Tight trousers never truly disappeared. They became a permanent fixture of the men's fashion toward the late Victorian period, proving once again that no amount of legislation can stop humans from wanting to look attractive. Victorian England tried to legislate trousers. Trousers won, and the country survived even with the scandalous danger of clearly defined calves. Victorian England adored music, but only indoors, only at respectable volumes, and preferably only when performed by someone with enough training to avoid offending the wallpaper. Outside, absolutely not. Outdoor singing was already flirting with felony in some boroughs, but outdoor pianos were a full-blown public menace. Yes, genuinely, some towns banned rolling pianos into gardens, parks, yards, porches, and even as driveways because they feared spontaneous rowdy music outbreaks. To modern ears, this sounds delightfully absurd, but to Victorians, outdoor pianos represented a terrifying trifecta of chaos: noise, freedom, and unregulated joy, a combination guaranteed to give local councils indigestion. To understand the panic, imagine a Victorian neighbourhood on a sunny afternoon. The birds are chirping, the milkman is clattering, children are skipping rope, and suddenly someone wheels a piano into their garden. A piano, outdoors, in the open air, where sound travels freely like an unlicensed hooligan. Immediately a neighbour peers through lace curtains, clutching her pearls. Another runs to fetch the constable, and somewhere a city official senses a disturbance in the moral fabric of the nation. Why? Because Victorians believed outdoor piano playing could spark uproarious music gatherings that might spiral into dancing, and dancing, as far as Victorian moralists were concerned, ranked somewhere between pickpocketing and summoning demons. The piano problem began innocently enough. Heavy as they were, Victorian pianos were still movable with determination, a wheel cart, and two reliable male relatives. People started dragging their pianos onto porches for small gatherings or into gardens during warm months. These were not quiet instruments. Pianos could command the air like a musical general, drowning out conversations, church bells, and the sound of horses sulking at their hitching posts. And once a piano began playing, neighbours gathered. Children appeared. Couples lingered. Worse, strangers might join in. The scene could easily escalate into a full-scale community event which frightened the Victorian establishment worse than a swarm of improperly supervised umbrellas. Some councils feared the rise of what they called garden orchestras. In their imaginations, this was not a harmless evening of music. No, they pictured dozens of people crowding a backyard, tapping their feet, clapping along, and perhaps, horror of horrors, swaying rhythmically in public. One London alderman declared, "Outdoor pianos invite unregulated festivity," which is probably the most Victorian sentence in existence. The idea that joy could break out without government permission was unacceptable. As a result, towns began passing restrictions. No piano shall be brought into any garden, yard, or front porch. Pianos must not be wheeled onto public walkways. Any musical performance audible from the street must have prior approval. no pianos to be played in view of passers-by. Some towns went further, forbidding pianos from being near open windows unless the window was firmly shut, because melodic contagion may spread. They spoke of music as if it were an airborne pathogen. Then there were concerns about public decency. Authorities worried that outdoor piano performances could cause people to linger outside after acceptable hours, mingle with neighbours they barely knew, or gasp, enjoy themselves in the shadows of evening. Music had long been seen as a wielder of emotion. Outdoors, it might inspire spontaneity, loosened inhibitions, or the Victorian equivalent of vibing. One particularly panicked local council warned that outdoor musical gatherings led to high spirits, irregular foot movements, and occasional clapping. Irregular foot movements. The horror. There was also the belief that outdoor pianos created class mixing. Nearby residents of different incomes might gather and mingle over shared tunes, shattering the delicate social hierarchy that Victorians maintained with the precision of clockmakers. Upper-middle-class families feared that music drifting from a garden piano might attract undesirable loiterers, a blanket phrase referring to anyone they didn't personally know, or anyone whose hat wasn't sufficiently respectable. Then came the noise complaints. Unlike humming or whistling, which were outlawed at night, pianos were powerful enough to terrify the entire street at any hour. Some musicians, playing with great enthusiasm and questionable skill, produced noises that could only be described as heroic attempts. A badly played piano piece was torture. Imagine the Victorian version of a child practicing scales while neighbours tried to enjoy their tea. Lawmakers concluded that restricting outdoor pianos was simply an act of communal self-defence, but the enforcement was the best part. Constables were actually dispatched to inspect gardens for illicit pianos. They would stroll past hedges like undercover agents listening for suspicious arpeggios. If they spotted someone attempting to wheel a piano across the lawn, they'd intervene immediately. "Sir, you're in violation of Municipal Ordinance 47B, unauthorised relocation of musical apparatus." In some towns, officers carried small notebooks where they wrote down piano offenders. Repeat offenders risked fines or strongly worded court summonses explaining the dangers of ungoverned merriment. The laws also sparked creativity. Some Victorians, desperate for fresh air and fresh music, invented loopholes. A few households put wheels on smaller instruments like harmoniums, arguing they weren't technically pianos. Others built covered porches they claimed counted as interior space. One ingenious family hosted piano evenings by installing casters and rolling the piano halfway out the window. Still inside, yet delightfully breezy. These evasions led to even more regulations, because nothing provokes Victorian lawmakers like people enjoying loopholes. Councils clarified that any instrument partially outside counted as outdoors. Music drifting out of open windows? Also suspicious. Porch performances? Highly questionable. Garden gatherings? Potentially catastrophic. In the end, the Great Outdoor Piano Panic reflects the Victorian instinct to tame anything unpredictable, especially sound, pleasure, and community gatherings that weren't pre-approved by someone wearing a monocle. Outdoor pianos were outlawed not simply because they made noise, but because they symbolised spontaneity. And spontaneity was the one thing Victorian society could never fully trust. Because in their minds, today it's a piano in the garden, tomorrow it's dancing, and next week, absolute pandemonium. Victorians treated funerals with the seriousness of a royal coronation and the choreography of a delicate ballet. They believed mourning was a public performance, a moral duty, and an essential demonstration of respectability. But because Victorians were pathologically allergic to unregulated emotion, they created a sprawling network of rules, official, semi-official, and aggressively social, dictating exactly how one ought to behave at a funeral. Cry too much? Fine. Cry too little? Suspicious. Cry at the wrong moment? Catastrophic. Victorians, the undisputed masters of emotional moderation. To understand this regulatory obsession, you must remember that Victorian society was powered by appearances. Every event, especially solemn ones, needed to project dignity. Funerals weren't private grieving rituals. They were public ceremonies in which every participant was expected to display the precise amount of grief, timed and calibrated like a malfunctioning metronome. Deviate from the expected emotional script, and you risk being judged, fined, or verbally tackled by a moral committee. Let's begin with the most bizarre rule: fines for crying too loudly. Some towns actually passed ordinances discouraging excessive wailing during funerals. Why? Because loud grief was considered a disturbance to the neighbourhood, a threat to public order, and, most egregiously, undignified. Victorian manuals insisted that respectable grief should fall within a measured emotional range. If you sobbed too loudly, you weren't expressing grief. You were demanding attention. And nothing irritated Victorians more than the thought of someone seeking attention without permission. Constables stationed near churches and cemeteries were expected to intervene if mourning became unnecessarily theatrical. Imagine weeping over your loved one and having a policeman tap your shoulder and whisper, "Ma'am, I must ask you to reduce the emotional volume." Yet the opposite extreme was equally dangerous. Not crying enough at a funeral was practically an act of social rebellion. A dry-eyed mourner risked accusations of coldness, callousness, or secret joy. Etiquette guides warned that insufficient mourning diminished the solemnity of the event and revealed a want of natural sentiment. Some communities issued fines or warnings for insufficient participation in grief, a phrase that is equal parts horrifying and darkly hilarious. And so Victorians invented a highly specific crying target. Not too loud, not too soft, not too dramatic, not too stoic. Perfectly balanced, as all Victorian emotions had to be. To manage this unstable emotional landscape, families sometimes hired professional mourners, whose job was to cry on cue, loudly enough to demonstrate tragedy, but politely enough to avoid regulatory issues. These professionals practiced sobbing in front of mirrors, refining their technique the way opera singers refine their vibrato. It was emotional capitalism at its finest. But grief wasn't the only regulated aspect of funerals. Funeral procession behaviour was subject to rules as detailed as military drills. Walk too fast, disrespectful, walk too slow, impeding public thoroughfares. Look around, you seemed bored. Make eye contact with someone, unthinkable. Laugh, jail. Well, maybe not jail, but certainly scandal. Even the angle of one's head was subject to commentary. Etiquette books recommended that mourners tilt their heads downward at no less than 15 degrees, ensuring an air of pious sadness without risking neck strain. Then came the rules about conversation. Talking during a funeral was heavily restricted. Whispering was tolerated only if the whisper content related to the deceased's virtues. Whispering about the weather, the food at the wake, or your neighbour's new wallpaper. A grievous violation. Some towns even had written bans on frivolous conversation near churchyards. Imagine a law that treats gossiping on consecrated ground as a misdemeanour. Funeral attire, too, was monitored with judicial interest. Mourners were expected to wear appropriate shades of black, with forbidden exceptions including black that was too shiny, too cheerful, black that was closer to charcoal, too casual, fabrics that rustled too loudly, too disruptive, garments that fit too well, too stylish and unacceptable during sorrow. Yes, Victorians believed fashion should mourn too, and then there were rules about children, who were considered unpredictable emotional grenades. Children at funerals were tightly controlled. Laughing, whining, skipping, or asking innocent questions like, "Why is everyone here?" could cause family disgrace. Some families banned children altogether, fearing their natural liveliness could contaminate the solemn atmosphere like an outbreak of juvenile joy. But the most astonishing rule of all concerned the length and enthusiasm of mourning itself. Funerals were just the beginning of a multi-stage grief marathon. Mourning attire had strict timelines, no shortening mourning periods unless you wanted whispers. Mourning behaviour, how often you socialised, how you spoke, how loudly you walked, was also dictated by the societal expectations. If you ended mourning too fast, you appeared heartless. If you mourned too long, you were melodramatic. Again, the Victorian sweet spot, the exact middle of emotional expression. Perhaps the most unintentionally comedic regulation was the warning against overly cheerful post-funeral gatherings. Wakes were allowed, but only if conducted with quiet dignity. Eating too enthusiastically, laughing at a childhood memory, or retelling a humorous anecdote about the deceased could all be interpreted as breaches of protocol. One etiquette writer actually cautioned, "Let no merry spirit arise until 1 full hour has passed after the interment." Nothing says compassion like a grief cool-down timer, but underneath all this rigidity was a truth Victorians never admitted. Funerals frightened them. They were emotionally messy events, and Victorian culture feared messiness more than death itself. Laws and etiquette provided a buffer, a way to feel in control of something fundamentally uncontrollable. Thus, the anti-funeral misconduct regulations weren't really about funerals. They were about preserving the illusion that even grief could be organised, measured and tamed. Victorians couldn't prevent death, but they could scold you for crying incorrectly. Victorian England loved hats, loved them so much in fact, that headwear practically became a second national language, one spoken in feathers, ribbons, brims, and the occasional architectural marvel that threatened to knock over every object within a 3-foot radius. But with great hats came great chaos. Huge hats clogged sidewalks, caused carriage collisions, toppled street displays, whacked unsuspecting pedestrians, and spawned enough newspaper outrage to make an editor faint into his morning tea. And thus, inevitably, Victorian lawmakers stepped in, because nothing frightened authorities more than unregulated head accessories. To understand why hat laws became necessary, you must first grasp the sheer size of Victorian hats. These weren't dainty little things perched politely on one's head. These were events. Women's hats, especially during the later Victorian period, ballooned into elaborate creations decorated with full bouquets, stuffed birds, plumage explosions, beaded ornaments, and sometimes entire dioramas of questionable taste. Some hats were so large that they required reinforcement wire, essentially turning the wearer into a fashionable satellite dish. Men's hats were less decorative but equally problematic. The top hat, for instance, could reach heights that gave passing lampposts anxiety. Too tall, too rigid, too reflective. These hats could blind a horse, startle a clergyman, or scrape along the ceiling of a poorly designed railway carriage. The trouble began when fashion collided with infrastructure. Victorian cities were crowded, narrow, bustling places. Hats that extended several inches or several feet in any direction became public hazards. Women wearing giant hats regularly blocked entire segments of the sidewalk, creating pedestrian bottlenecks that annoyed city officials almost as much as nighttime singing. The hats served as mobile traffic cones, except far more decorative and significantly more dangerous. Newspapers delighted in reporting the chaos. Articles appeared with titles like "Hat Havoc on the High Street," "A Feathery Menace," "Pedestrian Crushed Under Seasonal Millinery." One infamous editorial complained that large hats threatened to dethrone common courtesy, which is a very Victorian way of saying your hat hit me in the face. Men weren't immune either. Top hats, when caught in strong winds, became airborne missiles. A gusty day in Manchester once sent a gentleman's hat flying directly into a fishmonger's display, causing both injury to the hat and scandal to the fish. Commentators urged men to secure their hats with greater responsibility, as if hats were wayward children in need of discipline. All this culminated in hat-related ordinances. Hat laws began appearing in city regulations, dress codes and transit rules. They varied by location, but all shared the same purpose: prevent civilians from weaponizing fashion. Common rules included 1. Restrictions on hat size. Some councils actually introduced maximum measurements for hats worn in public spaces. The logic was simple: nothing larger than what could reasonably pass through a door without causing mayhem. Milliners groaned, socialites protested, policemen celebrated. 2. No hats that obstructed public thoroughfares. Hats could not. Block shop entrances impede walking space. Obscure street signage cause a pedestrian to deviate from his natural course of motion. If your hat forced someone to sidestep into mud, horse droppings, or moving traffic, you were officially a public nuisance. 3. Regulations on hat decoration. Feathers were singled out as particularly hazardous. Long plumes acted like Victorian windshield wipers, sweeping across the faces of passers-by. Some towns limited decoration height because tall hats created visibility issues for others, and for the wearer, who often had no idea their hat was wreaking havoc behind them. Taxidermy elements also became controversial. Hats adorned with entire birds, small animals, or, in one extraordinary case, a stuffed squirrel caused enough commotion that laws were proposed banning excessive zoological millinery. 4. Carriage and omnibus restrictions. Public transportation suffered greatly under hat mania. Women wearing enormous hats blocked views, knocked other passengers, and sometimes got stuck in the door frames. Men's top hats posed the opposite problem. They had to either remove their hats or risk embedding them into the carriage ceiling. Transport companies instituted new rules. Hats must be removed inside enclosed vehicles. Excessively large hats must be placed on the lap. Passengers must not wear hats likely to endanger the comfort of others, which is a kind way of saying, please stop whacking each other. 5. Theatre and music hall hat bans. One of the biggest hat controversies erupted in theatres. Women routinely refused to remove their towering hats, blocking the view of everyone behind them. Entire performances were ruined by hats resembling ship sails. Audience members wrote enraged letters demanding regulation. Some theatres introduced hat removal zones. Others employed ushers to politely request removal. A task that occasionally led to shouting matches, dramatic fan fluttering, and once an emergency intermission, the Great Hat Scandals. Inevitably Kurztau. Enforcement led to drama. One well-documented case involved a woman whose feathered hat was so large it caused a minor street accident when a passing carriage veered to avoid it. The incident sparked a citywide debate about whether fashion was becoming too bold, a question that every generation has asked at least once. Another scandal erupted when a man refused to remove his towering top hat in church, claiming it upheld his dignity. The vicar disagreed. Voices were raised. A feather fell. A small child fainted. It was glorious. Why the laws were even necessary. At its core, the Victorian hat crisis reveals a simple truth. Victorians loved rules almost as much as they loved dramatic headwear. Hats were symbols of identity, class, style, ambition, and occasionally reckless disregard for public safety. Regulation was inevitable. The laws were attempts to restore order in a society where hats kept getting larger, taller, fluffier, and more capable of causing mild physical harm. And yet, even with rules, conflict continued. Fashion, after all, does not like being told what to do. The bigger the crackdown, the bigger the hats became, a phenomenon now known informally as the millinery escalation principle. In the end, Victorian hat laws weren't about hats at all. They were about space. They were about visibility. They were about dignity. And most importantly, they were about preventing one's neighbour from accidentally decapitating a stranger with an overly enthusiastic ostrich plume. Victorian England was a world that regulated everything: hats, umbrellas, nighttime singing, pedestrian speed, even funeral volume. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared the public for one of the strangest legal crusades of the era: the campaign against suspicious vegetables. Yes, vegetables. Because in a society constantly teetering between moral panic and overcooked cabbage, even produce could be deemed a threat. To modern minds, a carrot is a carrot. A turnip is a turnip. A potato is, well, a potato. But to certain Victorian reformers, oddly shaped vegetables possessed dangerous powers. Powers capable of triggering improper thoughts, lowering the moral tone of the marketplace, or causing women to faint into their shopping baskets. And so naturally, the solution was regulation. Let's begin with the Victorian produce market, a place filled with shouting vendors, jostling crowds, runaway carts, and the overwhelming smell of onions. These markets were the beating heart of cities, lively, unpredictable, and slightly chaotic. Add in vegetables that grew into unusual shapes, and you suddenly had items that captured too much attention. Victorians loved order. Vegetables that refused to grow properly violated both nature and public decorum. Officials worried that certain vegetables, if sold publicly, might provoke laughter, inspire vulgar jokes, fuel inappropriate imagination, undermine societal respectability, or all of the above. One London council member famously proclaimed that vegetables must uphold the dignity of the empire. Imagine writing that sentence with a straight face. What qualified as a suspicious vegetable? Pretty much anything that wasn't perfectly symmetrical. Markets in several towns implemented rules banning the sale or display of potatoes with curves resembling human outline, carrots that forked into two legs, which suggested impropriety, cucumbers deemed too robust in form, parsnips that grew in tangled shapes, squashes with bulges deemed indecorous, turnips that resembled anything too expressive. One borough in northern England banned a batch of radishes because their growth appeared mocking. No one knows exactly what that means, but the radishes were escorted off the premises as if they had committed a misdemeanour. Local boards posted notices warning that vegetable anomalies shall not be presented for sale, as if the produce had committed a personal moral betrayal. Inspectors patrolled market stalls with the solemnity of customs agents, lifting turnips, rotating carrots, and squinting at potatoes like detectives solving botanical crimes. Vendors protested, and of course they did. A grocer named Mr. Hargreaves pleaded during a town meeting. Vegetables grow as they please, and I cannot persuade a carrot of proper behaviour. But Victorian lawmakers, in their unmatched confidence, believed vegetables could and should be reformed through strict agricultural discipline. Why all this panic? Because Victorians believed that objects, even vegetables, could influence human character. They worried that seeing a vulgar-looking carrot might spark mischievous humour or unseemly imaginings. They feared that young men would giggle, that young women would blush, and that older citizens would write angry letters to national newspapers demanding action. And nothing triggered Victorian lawmakers faster than letters. Newspapers, for their part, gleefully fanned the flames. Stories with headlines like, "An indecent parsnip removed from Market Square," "Suspicious cucumber seized by constable," "Grocer fined for vulgar potato display." These reports became public entertainment, portraying produce as if it were a misbehaving cast in a comedy drama. In one memorable incident, a farmer was accused of displaying morally questionable vegetables after a customer fainted at the sight of a butternut squash with an awkward curvature. The poor farmer tried to explain that squash are naturally chaotic objects, but the magistrate was uninterested. The squash was confiscated and the farmer fined for violating community standards. Another scandal erupted when a potato remarkably shaped like a face became a local sensation. Crowds flocked to see it. Children pointed. Adults whispered. The town council panicked. They ordered the potato removed immediately, fearing it might inspire idolatry or levity. The potato sadly disappeared. Its fate remains unknown, though rumours claim an amused council clerk kept it as a paperweight. Markets responded to these crackdowns by sorting vegetables more aggressively. Vendors created backroom bins filled with produce too crooked or knobbly for legal display. These forbidden vegetables were sold quietly to regular customers, like contraband root vegetables whispered about but never seen publicly. Housewives bought them quickly, sometimes under the table, as though smuggling illicit contraptions rather than carrots. Victorian etiquette books even weighed in. One advised housewives to pre-inspect vegetables for offensive shapes before serving them at dinner. Another instructed that vegetables of questionable form must be sliced prior to table appearance, as if chopping them prevented moral corruption. Perhaps the most astonishing part of this saga is how seriously the public took it. Vegetable shape became a topic of earnest conversation. Mrs. Finch, did you hear? The grocer had to remove a scandalous cucumber yesterday. Oh dear, the markets aren't what they used to be. The entire affair reveals the Victorian obsession with superficial respectability. The shape of a vegetable had no real consequence, but to them, everything in public view needed to uphold the illusion of perfect morality. A strangely shaped carrot, by virtue of its audacity, shattered that illusion. Underlying it all was the Victorian fear of anything natural that behaved unpredictably. Irregularity was associated with disorder. Disorder led to anxiety. Anxiety led to committees. Committees led to regulations, and regulations led to criminalised vegetables. So yes, Victorians policed produce, they censored squash, they exiled parsnips, they looked a potato in the eye, literally in some cases, and declared it a threat to society. It is perhaps the most Victorian thing they ever did. Of all Victorian laws, few capture the era's dizzying blend of piety, paranoia, and poultry-based chaos quite like the rules governing what pets you were allowed to walk on Sundays. Yes, not whether you could walk pets or where, but what kind of creatures were permitted to stroll the streets during the sacred Sabbath. And while dogs and the occasional well-behaved cat were tolerated, other animals triggered moral alarm bells loud enough to rattle the parish windows. Some towns banned walking goats, others banned pigs. Still others targeted geese with a zeal that suggests at least one local vicar lost a theological argument to a waterfowl. Their justification? These animals caused Sabbath disruptions, a phrase so wonderfully Victorian it practically smells like lavender water and passive-aggressive judgment. To understand the Sunday pet panic, you must remember that Victorian Sundays were not casual, cosy days filled with brunch and leisure. They were solemn occasions of rest, moral reflection, and doing absolutely nothing that might resemble fun. Activities were restricted, shops closed, entertainment paused. Even conversation was expected to be subdued. Walking your goat down the street, therefore, was not simply a walk. It was a bold act of potential spiritual sabotage. Let's start with goats, the first victims of the Sunday pet crackdown. Goats, as any farmer will tell you, have a talent for chaos. They leap, bleat, nibble, and test boundaries with the energy of a creature fueled entirely by mischief and forbidden snacking. Victorian towns discovered that Sunday goat walking frequently resulted in goats eating flowers from churchyards, goats butting churchgoers, goats making indecent noises during sermons, goats escaping mid-walk to headbutt hats or steal unattended bread. Such incidents, while objectively hilarious, outraged moral committees. Elders complained that goats injected levity and disorder into the Lord's Day. Some councils banned them entirely, posting signs that read, "No goats permitted on Sabbath footways." You know you've hit peak Victorian when a legal document contains the phrase Sabbath footway. Next came pigs, who caused even greater uproar. Pigs were intelligent, adorable, and deeply committed to living their best lives, but they were also noisy, unapologetically curious, and likely to snuffle loudly during prayer time. Victorians considered pigs too earthy, too unrefined, too pig-like for Sunday decorum. A pig on a leash was bad enough. A pig that managed to slip free on a Sunday? That was practically a theological event. Reports describe pigs wandering into public squares, disrupting quiet reflection with enthusiastic grunts, and once, in an infamous Bristol incident, overturning a lady's picnic basket because it smelled jam. The scandal inspired a Sunday ordinance banning all perambulatory swine. Then there were geese, perhaps the most controversial pets of all. Geese are bold, geese are loud, geese do not negotiate with humans. To walk a goose in Victorian England was to parade a honking time bomb of righteous fury through the streets. On weekdays, this was merely inconvenient. On Sundays, it was an abomination. Town records list numerous complaints. Geese blocking church entrances, geese attacking hats, geese chasing children, geese attacking other geese attacking vicars, multiple times across multiple counties. One outraged citizen claimed in a letter to the editor, "No Sabbath can remain holy whilst geese roam it freely." That same week, the council passed a law banning unnecessary poultry locomotion. Victorians genuinely believed these animals disturbed the spiritual atmosphere. A single goose honk echoing through a quiet street could send elderly parishioners into cardiac distress. Ministers preached sermons about maintaining the dignity of the Sabbath and warned that walking disruptive animals was equivalent to disrespecting God's order. It was a theological collision between Victorian religiosity and the natural behaviour of farm animals. Notably, dogs remained acceptable companions as long as they behaved. A gentleman walking a quiet dog was seen as exhibiting discipline and moral restraint. A gentleman being dragged down the road by a barking dog? Very different story. In such cases, the constable might intervene with a stern lecture about inappropriate canine exuberance, a crime punishable by social shame and the possibility of a fine for disturbing the peace through animal mismanagement. Cats were rarely walked, because cats, then as now, refused to participate in anything resembling obedience. But if someone attempted it, towns generally allowed it on the grounds that a cat strolling calmly was unlikely to inspire riotous behaviour. Victorians trusted cats more than goats. History has not proven them wrong. Some towns even published lists specifying which animals were allowed outdoors on Sundays. Typical entries included dogs, quiet, cats, if willing, caged songbirds, as long as they remained in their cages, tortoises, goldfish in bowls, though this was mostly theoretical. Forbidden animals included goats, too unruly, pigs, too distracting, geese, too combative, turkeys, too dramatic, peacocks, too proud, too loud, and much too flamboyant for the Sabbath. One town in Kent even banned ferrets after a Sunday incident involving two boys, one ferret and a public fountain. The details were never released, but judging by the ban, it probably didn't go well. Ultimately, the Sunday pet laws were less about animals and more about control. Victorians believed Sunday should be serene, predictable, and morally uplifting. Animals, meanwhile, believed Sundays were an excellent opportunity to do whatever they wanted. It was a conflict of values, temperament, and species. The laws also reveal a charming truth about Victorian England. They feared joy in all its forms, especially the unpredictable, feathery, bleating kind. Sunday was a day for solemn hats, quiet footsteps, and staring at wallpaper while contemplating scripture. If someone's goose exploded into honking chaos, the illusion shattered. And so, to protect the sanctity of the Sabbath, they regulated pets. Not people, pets. It was a uniquely Victorian solution to a uniquely Victorian problem. Chewing gum, as we know it today, didn't properly arrive in Britain until the late 19th century, but that didn't stop Victorians from panicking about it long before it existed. In classic Victorian fashion, they managed to worry themselves sick over chewing substances, a broad category that included everything from tree resins to paraffin wax to mysterious imported sticks that looked suspiciously like fun. And because Victorians viewed recreational chewing as morally dubious, socially corrosive and potentially civilization-ending, public rules sprang up to regulate it. That's right. Victorian England passed anti-gum rules before gum was even gum. To understand this fear, you have to realise that Victorians loathed the sight of people enjoying anything with their mouths unless it involved tea and misery. Chewing, visible chewing, rhythmic chewing, pleasure-based chewing was scandalous. It looked casual, it looked American. Worst of all, it looked like people were experiencing happiness without permission. The earliest panic began with chewing resins. Natural substances people chewed to freshen breath or pass time. Sailors chewed pitch. Children chewed pine resin. Market boys chewed hardened sap from whatever tree they found first. None of these substances were glamorous. Most tasted like regret, but they served a function, and unfortunately that function included public display. Victorians could not abide the idea of someone walking down the street making repeated jaw movements. It struck them as undignified, animalistic, and disturbingly modern. A chewing jaw implied relaxation. Relaxation implied idleness. Idleness implied moral decline. It was a slippery slope from chewing resin in public to the collapse of British values. Newspapers began warning about the creeping habit of public mastication. They described chewers as loitering, lip-moving delinquents whose jaws worked with foreign enthusiasm. One satirical magazine joked that Britain could withstand war, famine, or political crisis, but a nation openly chewing in daylight hours would surely fall. Then came paraffin wax, the true catalyst of the anti-chewing crusade. In the 1850s and 1860s, paraffin wax candies became popular, cheap, flavourless lumps that children chewed for hours. They didn't dissolve, they didn't taste good, they didn't benefit anyone. But they were quiet, repetitive, and deeply frowned upon. Adults were horrified. Teachers reported students chewing in class, jaws moving like tiny steam engines. Parents complained their children looked like cows at pasture. Ministers warned that chewing wax encouraged slothful habits. One temperance advocate declared that chewing substances were the idle man's intoxicant, which is a strange accusation for something that tasted like candle stubs. Inevitably, local councils stepped in. Enter the no chewing rules. They appeared town by town, usually under vague headings like your rules against public chewing, ordinance regarding indecorous mouth movements, regulation on improper masticatory conduct. Most forbade chewing substances in public streets, churchyards, tram stations, school entrances, public gardens within 20 feet of government buildings. For reasons no one adequately explained, constables were instructed to intervene if they spotted persistent chewing, issuing stern warnings such as, "Put that wax away, lad." Repeat offenders, usually children or bored apprentices, could be fined for public nuisance chewing. Some towns published pamphlets arguing that gum-like substances weakened discipline. Others claimed that visible chewing encouraged envy among poorer children who lacked access to wax. One moral society warned that chewing in public could inspire vulgar mimicry, which sounds like the beginning of a truly unsettling chain reaction. What exactly did they fear? Masses of children spontaneously chewing in unison. Churches joined the campaign. Ministers insisted that chewing during sermons was disrespectful, distracting, and reminiscent of livestock. Meanwhile, schoolmasters waged all-out war against wax chewers. Students caught chewing were forced to spit out the substance into buckets ominously labelled offending chews. Some schools banned paraffin candies entirely, others forbade children to open their mouths during lessons unless answering a question. Then things escalated. A few cities began claiming that discarded wax lumps posed environmental hazards. They stuck to shoes, they clogged gutters, they confused dogs. One report warned that birds mistook wax lumps for food and flew away, disgusted and affronted. Whether this was true or Victorian melodrama is anyone's guess. The arrival of actual chewing gum from America in the late 19th century only made things worse. Victorian commentators distrusted anything that originated in the United States. Jazz, slang, relaxed posture, chewing gum. So when American gum arrived, the moral panic reached hysterical heights. Newspapers lamented the infectious gum habit spreading through youth. They claimed gum chewing was vulgar, noisy, slovenly, a threat to posture, destructive to enamel, indicative of weak character, a possible gateway to dancing. One London paper even described gum chewers as jaw athletes lacking dignity. Councils extended earlier anti-chewing rules to include gum explicitly, sometimes labelling it vulgar American resin. Some towns banned gum from trams and omnibuses, others from public parks. The strictest prohibited the sale of gum entirely on Sundays, arguing that the Sabbath must not be contaminated by elastic confections. Perhaps the most astonishing part of the anti-chewing crusade was how unnecessary it all was. Resin chewing was harmless. Wax chewing was tacky but benign. Early gum was a novelty, yet Victorian lawmakers treated it like a moral contagion that could dissolve the foundations of British propriety. But at its core, the rules reveal something deeply Victorian, a terror of anything that blurred the line between public decorum and private comfort. Chewing in public looked relaxed, it looked informal, it looked modern, and modernity scared Victorians just as much as oddly shaped vegetables or renegade umbrellas. Ultimately, the anti-chewing laws faded as gum became mainstream. But while they lasted, Victorians waged one of history's strangest battles against jaws, wax, and the scandalous possibility that someone, somewhere, might be chewing joyfully. Victorian England had a relationship with bells that can only be described as intense. To modern ears, a bell is just a sound, a ding, a ring, a reminder that your food is ready or someone wants your attention. But to Victorians, bells were sacred instruments of order. They marked time, signalled authority, governed social hierarchy, and kept the sprawling machinery of daily life moving with clockwork certainty, which is precisely why the Victorians did what Victorians always did when confronted with something they relied on but didn't quite trust. They regulated the life out of it. Church bells, shop bells, school bells, factory bells, ship bells, handbells, servant bells. If it could ring, it was subject to scrutiny. If it made noise, it needed guidelines. If someone rang it inappropriately, a moral void opened, threatening to swallow the entire neighbourhood. Thus, a sprawling patchwork of bell laws and bell etiquette emerged across Britain, turning something as simple as ringing a bell into a ceremonial act requiring dignity, timing, and sometimes legal permission. Let's begin with church bells, the monarchs of the Victorian soundscape. Church bells had authority. They governed Sundays, weddings, funerals, public emergencies, and the daily rhythm of towns. Their ringing had to follow strict protocols. Certain bells were reserved exclusively for clergy-approved events. Others were assigned to specific times of day. Most importantly, no one was allowed to ring them without authorization. Unauthorized bell ringing was considered a theological misdemeanor. In some parishes, pulling a church bell rope without permission could get you fined or publicly shamed. One teenager, caught ringing the bell at 9 p.m. for fun, was reportedly forced to apologize during the Sunday sermon. Authorities described his crime as unholy noise instigated by juvenile recklessness. Even within the church, only specially trained bell ringers, often entire guilds, were allowed to perform. They practiced complex sequences called changes, a mathematical art form that Victorians performed with the seriousness of surgeons. These guilds protected their traditions fiercely. If someone outside their circle touched a bell rope, it wasn't just rude, it was an affront to centuries of auditory tradition. Then there were school bells, which governed children's lives with tyrannical precision. Victorian schoolmasters believed punctuality was the backbone of morality, so the school bell became a weapon of discipline. Students were conditioned to respond instantly. Late arrivals, especially after the bell, were treated as personal insults to the educational system. Because the bell's authority was absolute, ringing it required strict oversight. Only designated monitors or the headmaster could ring it. Rumours spread that children who dared touch the bell rope unsupervised would be expelled or forced to write lines until their wrists fell off. Whether true or not, children treated the bell like a relic charged with dangerous energy. Factory bells were even more regulated. In industrial Britain, factories used bells to structure every minute of the workday. Ring at the wrong time and hundreds of workers could stop mid-task, assume their shift was over, and walk out like startled birds. Ring too early and chaos erupted. Ring too late, and workers filed complaints or demanded compensation for bell-related confusion. Some towns required factories to register their bell schedules with municipal offices to prevent sonic interference with church and school bells. Victorian newspapers even reported bell disputes, where two institutions argued because their bells rang at overlapping times. In one village, a school bell and a factory bell created such dissonance at 3 p.m. each day that residents held a meeting to negotiate a sonic treaty. But the most heavily policed bells weren't the big ones. Oh no, They were the tiny, scandalously portable handbells and shop bells. Shopkeepers were required to use bells in moderation. A bell over the door was acceptable, but it had to be of reasonable size and tone, as too loud a bell could cause undue startlement. A London grocer once faced fines because his shop bell rang so forcefully that a customer dropped a jar of pickles and accused the shop of bell-induced fright. Peddlers and street sellers also used handbells to announce their arrival, but many towns restricted which trades could ring them. A fishmonger? Allowed. A toy seller? Allowed. Someone selling questionable medicinal tonics? Absolutely not. Handbells were seen as official tools of legitimate commerce, not instruments of auditory deception. If you rang a bell selling anything suspicious, officers could confiscate both your bell and your dignity. Then we arrive at one of the most peculiar categories: servant bells. Victorian households relied heavily on internal bell systems, networks of wires and pulleys allowing wealthy residents to summon servants from various parts of the house. These bells were labelled by room, drawing room, morning room, blue bedroom, and were treated with enormous seriousness. There were rules. Bells must not be rung frivolously. Bells must not be rung in quick succession, too urgent. Bells must not be rung repeatedly, too rude. Bells must not be rung without a specific purpose. In some cities, manuals warned mistresses not to misuse the bell system, because authorities feared it contributed to overworked servants and domestic discord. That's right, Victorian municipalities were worried about bell-based power abuse within households. Servants also faced rules. Only the designated servant could answer a particular bell. A kitchen maid caught answering the drawing room bell might be scolded for social overreach. A footman answering the scullery bell risked being told he was undermining the natural order of the universe. And then there were bells used for public signalling: fire alarms, town criers, militia drills, and emergency warnings. These bells could only be rung in true emergencies. Misuse was treated as a form of public fraud. In one case, a man who rang a town emergency bell to announce that his prize cow had given birth was fined for misapplication of civic alarm. Underlying all this regulation was one glorious truth. Victorians trusted bells more than human judgment. Bells told people when to wake up, go to work, worship, eat, study, sleep, and panic. Bells were the guardians of order. But precisely because they were so powerful, only the proper people were allowed to use them. The Victorian bell system was basically society's nervous system, and they didn't want any random person prodding the nerves. So they regulated the ringers, the rings, the timing, the purpose, the volume, the pitch, and sometimes even the number of rings. Because to a Victorian, a bell wasn't just a bell. It was civilization's tiny ringing spine. To truly understand Victorian England, one must understand its deepest, most unshakable truth. Tea was not a beverage. It was a national identity, a moral anchor, and a birthright. If the British Empire had a heartbeat, it pulsed Earl Grey. But with great passion came great paranoia. And with great paranoia came a towering stack of regulations controlling everything from tea weights to tea dust to whether your tea leaves were suspiciously shiny. Victorian lawmakers regulated tea the way modern governments regulate nuclear facilities, cautiously, nervously, and with a hint of caffeine dependency. Victorians drank tea constantly, morning, afternoon, evening, sometimes even at funerals, quietly, of course. But the tea they consumed wasn't always pure. The 19th century was a golden age of tea fraud. Unscrupulous merchants mixed leaves with anything vaguely leaf-shaped, added dyes and colours never intended for human consumption, and stuffed their blends with fillers like wood shavings, exhausted tea leaves, and, in one notorious case, iron filings that gave the tea a satisfyingly hearty crunch. Public outrage soared, and lawmakers swooped in like stern nannies discovering a child eating dirt. Thus began the tea regulations. 1. Laws against adulterated tea. Adulteration was so common that Parliament treated tea fraud like a national emergency. Inspectors performed surprise raids on warehouses, seizing leaves dyed green with copper salts, used tea leaves redried and sold as fresh tea bulked out with hedge clippings, leaves darkened with black lead mixtures that were only about 3% actual tea and 97% botanical improvisation. One inspector dramatically declared, "Some teas contain more garden than Ceylon," which was both true and an unintentional insult to British gardening. Merchants caught adulterating tea faced heavy fines, public shaming, or, worst of all, having their names printed in the newspaper under headings like "Wicked Tea Practices." Nothing destroyed a Victorian business faster than public accusation of wickedness. 2. The rules on tea mixing. Victorians were so paranoid about tea mixtures that laws emerged regulating which teas could be blended and in what proportions. Many tea dealers tried to extend their supply by mixing fine imported teas from China or India with cheaper local herbs or foreign leaves with questionable personalities. Popular adulterants included sloe leaves, willow leaves, and dead blackberry leaves. None of these imitations tasted remotely like tea. To combat this, some towns passed ordinances requiring merchants to display signs stating, "Pure tea sold here, no unholy mixtures." Tea mixing wasn't just a commercial fraud. It was seen as a personal betrayal. One London matron complained to a magistrate, "I purchased a psalm and instead received something resembling old broom." The magistrate, sympathetic, vowed to enforce stricter mixing laws. 3. Tea weights and the scales of justice. Weighing tea became its own battlefield. Because tea was expensive, merchants sometimes lightened their scoops. A pound became 14 ounces, an ounce became almost an ounce, a scoop became whatever the merchant felt like scooping. Victorian lawmakers, determined to uphold honesty in a nation where tea was sacred, established strict regulations. Scales had to be inspected weekly. Official weights had to be certified and stamped. Tea could only be sold in exact, legally defined quantities. Merchants caught scooping liberally were fined. Some inspectors were so humorless about weights that customers complained the scales were checked more often than the local fire pumps. 4. Bans on illegal tea leaves. Because the British Empire was expanding tea production across India and Ceylon, lawmakers became very touchy about illegal tea entering the market. Smuggled tea, especially cheaper Chinese teas, was treated with suspicion, moral outrage, and fixation bordering on obsession. Some regions cracked down heavily, posting notices like, "Unlicensed tea leaves shall not be sold within this parish." Imagine being a Victorian criminal, arrested not for theft or violence, but for possessing contraband leaves. Police occasionally raided properties, confiscating sacks of illegal tea like they were dangerous substances. Officers would dramatically sniff the leaves, declare them orientally suspicious, and drag them away to be burned, probably while drinking perfectly legal tea. 5. Suspicious tea dust and the infamous sweepings laws. At the bottom of tea chests lay something called dust, tiny particles, bits of leaf, and whatever debris floated down during shipping. Some merchants, ever opportunistic, collected this dust, packaged it, and sold it to the poor as economical tea. Customers quickly realised economical tea meant tea that tasted like ashes and disappointment. Authorities responded by passing restrictions on tea sweepings. These were classified as improper for human consumption, unfit for civilised stomachs, the residue of nefarious industry. Inspectors raided warehouses looking for sweepings, scooping handfuls of tea dust and sniffing them with exaggerated disgust. One inspector famously declared, "This substance is better suited for chimney birds than mankind." Nobody knows what chimney birds were, possibly soot-covered pigeons, but the message was clear. Tea dust was the enemy. 6. Patronising tea education campaigns. Victorians loved to lecture, and tea was no exception. Pamphlets circulated advising citizens on how to spot fraudulent tea. Some tips were reasonable. avoid leaves with metallic shine. Others were unhinged, rub leaf between fingers. If fingers feel insulted, suspect fraud. Tea testing became a weekly ritual. Families hosted small ceremonies where members would examine leaves under lamps, smell them, discuss their moral character, and declare whether the tea was virtuous enough for the household. Yes, Victorian tea had to be virtuous. 7. Why tea needed regulation at all. At its heart, the tea laws weren't really about protecting consumers from fraud, though that did matter. The real reason was cultural. Tea was the backbone of Victorian identity. Adulterated tea meant adulterated Britain. If the nation's most beloved drink could be corrupted, what else could be? Tea reminded Victorians of civilization, stability, empire, family, virtue, and the illusion that they were very calm and reasonable people. Threaten their tea and you threatened everything, so they regulated leaves, dust, weights, mixtures and imports. Because in Victorian England you could mess with many things, but not with the nation's afternoon cup. Victorian England was a land of great convictions. Convictions about morality, cleanliness, curtain alignment, window displays, the acceptable curvature of vegetables, and, most dramatically of all, the acceptable state of a policeman's upper lip. For decades, the British police force enforced one of the strangest grooming regulations in history. Police officers were forbidden from shaving their moustaches. A clean-shaven constable? Impossible, unthinkable, practically a threat to the empire. And then, without warning, the rule flipped overnight. Suddenly, officers were ordered to shave them off. It was one of the greatest bureaucratic mood swings in Victorian history, and it left a trail of confused constables, outraged facial hair enthusiasts, and more than a few moustache-shaped tan lines. The moustache mandate, when facial hair became policy. The requirement for police officers to wear moustaches emerged in the mid-19th century, during a period when Victorian masculinity was measured in quiet stoicism, stiff posture, and the ability to grow respectable facial ornamentation. The moustache was seen as the hallmark of authority, a hairy badge of honour that communicated masculinity, experience, and the capacity to shout, "Stop in the name of the law," with conviction. Regulations were explicit. No constable or sergeant was permitted to shave their upper lip. Doing so risked disciplinary action, which could range from formal admonishment to suspension for repeat offenders. A man could lose his job if his moustache failed to meet expectations. Imagine explaining that to your family. These rules were enforced with military seriousness. Supervisors inspected moustaches during morning lineup, ensuring officers had maintained the proper length, density and decorum of whisker. One manual even recommended that officers use moustache wax sparingly lest excessive sheen distract the public from respectable policing. Victorians believed moustaches made policemen look older, a plus, wiser even better, and more intimidating essential. A bare-lipped officer was considered too youthful, too approachable, and too likely to be mistaken for a choir boy delivering misdirected moral encouragement. The official justifications, a masterclass in Victorian logic. The reasons behind this rule were, unsurprisingly, very Victorian, a mix of superstition, social anxiety, and shallow pseudoscience. 1. Moustaches were believed to protect against illness. Some physicians claimed a moustache helped filter out dust, soot, and the various airborne terrors of industrial Britain. The idea that facial hair could function like a natural gas mask delighted Victorian imaginations. If your moustache trapped soot, congratulations, you were basically saving your lungs through heroic whisker action. 2. Moustaches symbolised moral authority. Victorians loved visual hierarchies. A moustache separated officers from civilians, lending an air of gravitas. Constables without moustaches, one editorial warned, lack the solemn bearing befitting guardians of public order. 3. Moustaches inspired fear in potential criminals. Whether this claim was ever tested is unclear, but the belief that criminals would tremble before a well-waxed officer was frequently repeated with absolute certainty. The Moustache Rebellion, The officers were not impressed. Not everyone loved the rule. Some men grew moustaches reluctantly, complaining that they itched. They collected London's smog, they froze in cold weather, they attracted small children who wanted to touch them, smelled like the damp streets they patrolled. Still, they complied, because nothing united Victorian bureaucracy like forcing men to suffer in the name of dignity. A few rebellious officers tried shaving anyway, hoping no one would notice. But supervisors noticed everything. One officer was famously dismissed for appearing at roll call with an upper lip of suspicious smoothness. The great flip, when the Empire suddenly said shave it off, and then, as if struck by divine revelation or sudden aesthetic boredom, the police administration reversed the rule. Suddenly moustaches were not required. Suddenly they were discouraged. Suddenly supervisors who once checked the thickness of men's whiskers were telling them to remove them immediately. It was chaos. The reversal came about in the early 20th century as modern hygiene standards rose and new medical thinking challenged earlier beliefs. Doctors started warning that moustaches could trap germs, so much for the protective barrier theory. Reformers argued that moustaches made the police look old-fashioned. Newspapers critiqued them as vestiges of a bygone paternalism, and so with barely a warning, officers received notices advising them to shave for the sake of public presentation. Imagine serving 20 years of moustache duty, nurturing it through heat waves, storms, soot-filled patrols, and countless cups of moustache-dampening tea, only to be ordered to remove it overnight. Some constables embraced their newfound freedom, shaving immediately and rediscovering the sensation of wind touching their upper lips for the first time in decades. Others resisted, insisting that a policeman without a moustache was a moral contradiction. One veteran refused to shave on principle and retired early, taking his distinguished whiskers with him. Meanwhile, members of the public were caught off guard. People struggled to recognize officers they'd known for years. Entire neighbourhoods reported confusion. "Constable Davies, is that you? Where's the rest of your face?" "Madam, it's me." They made a shave. Who? Why? What villainy is this? The aftermath, the legacy of facial hair. Confusion. The moustache mandate and its sudden reversal left an enduring legacy. It became a running joke in newspapers, fodder for satirists, and a cautionary tale about the dangers of over-regulating facial hair. Police memoirs written decades later still mentioned the Great Shaving Order, with a mix of trauma and fond nostalgia. The saga also revealed something deeply Victorian, an unwavering belief that appearance reflected character, and character reflected the stability of civilization itself. If a moustache helped keep order, Victorians endorsed it. If shaving became fashionable and medically advisable, they reversed course without blinking. Consistency wasn't important. Control was. In the end, the great anti-moustache on police force debate was never about moustaches. It was about authority, identity, image, moral panic, social conformity, and the endlessly entertaining Victorian habit of turning the smallest human detail into a matter of national concern. Victorians regulated many things: hats, candles, funerals, vegetables, shaped too optimistically, but nothing reveals their terror of spontaneous joy, quite like the laws against public laughing. Yes, certain regions in Victorian England genuinely fined people for laughing too loudly, too long, or too disruptively. It sounds like a joke, but to the Victorians, laughter wasn't just a sound. It was a social contagion, a threat to dignity, and, in their more melodramatic moments, a force as dangerous as cholera. To understand why laughter triggered moral committees, you must first understand the Victorian worldview. Society was a fragile construction, held together by politeness, self-control corsets, and the willingness to appear deeply unamused at all times. Laughter, that was a breach in the wall, a leak in the dam, a crack in the porcelain mask, and like everything else they feared, once the Victorians felt a sensation slipping out of their control, they wrapped it in rules, ordinances, and public warnings. Let's set the scene. Imagine a Victorian street, orderly, quiet, filled with people moving at a socially acceptable pace while wearing clothing designed to suppress every natural human impulse. The air smells faintly of coal smoke and boiling cabbage. A pair of gentlemen stroll by discussing parliamentary debates. A woman walks with her parasol angled precisely at 47 degrees. Everything is calm, and then someone laughs. Not a polite chuckle, not a soft ha, but an actual laugh, spontaneous, heartfelt, unexpected. Suddenly, every head turns. A child gasps. A vicar stops mid-step. A shopkeeper stares as though a stranger has shouted obscenities. Laughter in public was considered disruptive, irresponsible and, depending on your local newspaper, a sign of deteriorating social restraint. Victorian cities and towns responded with what they did best: regulations. Some local bylaws included clauses like, "No excessive laughter in the public space. Laughter shall not continue beyond the bounds of propriety. Persons shall not emit prolonged mirth in thoroughfares. Unseemly guffaws may result in fines." Official documents use terms such as explosive merriment, disruptive hilarity, and the wonderfully judgmental immodest laughter. Why? Because Victorians were convinced laughter was contagious. Contagion they understood. They were surrounded by epidemics. But laughter, that was a terrifying social infection. One London reform group even published a pamphlet claiming that unrestrained laughter spreads through crowds with alarming speed. It warned that laughter distracted workers, caused carriage accidents, encouraged frivolity, and, no joke, weakened the moral vigilance of the public. In their minds, one person laughing loudly could trigger a chain reaction. One person laughs, 3 people nearby chuckle, the entire street becomes disorderly. Someone tripped, a horse startles, chaos erupts, civilization collapses. It was the Victorian version of the domino effect. Public laughter policing became especially strict in libraries, train stations, marketplaces, promenades, churches, understandably. And anywhere within earshot of a moral society member, constables were trained to intervene when laughter crossed the invisible threshold from acceptable to heinously joyful. A policeman might approach a group of young people and say something like, "Sir, madam, I must insist you reduce your display of mirth. You are disturbing the decorum of the street." Imagine being fined for finding something funny. But laughter wasn't just regulated outdoors. Theatres, music halls, and public gatherings also imposed rules. Audiences were warned not to laugh excessively during performances, even comedic ones. A critic once complained that a comedy show had encouraged uncontrolled hooting, which he labelled dangerous. Dangerous. Another theatre posted a sign, "Applause permitted. Laughter should remain dignified." Because nothing ruins a joke like dignity. Households with servants also took laughter seriously. Servants could be scolded or dismissed for being overly cheerful in the hallways. Manuals warned that servants laughing within earshot of guests suggests frivolity and undermines household discipline. Housewives were advised to curb laughter during tea gatherings, as uncontained amusement lowers the tone. Even children weren't exempt. Schools enforced strict rules on playground laughter. Yes, playground laughter. Too much laughing was considered rowdy. Too little was sluggish. There was a precise middle zone of permitted childhood joy. One schoolmaster famously wrote, "Children should laugh but never erupt. Erupt, as though children were small volcanoes of chaos just waiting to blow." At the heart of these absurd restrictions was the Victorian obsession with self-control. Victorians believed that emotions should be contained, managed, and packaged into polite expressions. Laughter, spontaneous, loud, and unpredictable, was the opposite of Victorian decorum. It made people loosen up. It made them social. It made them forget their place in the social hierarchy. Even worse, laughter could be subversive. It could mock authority. A policeman with a moustache so rigid it could double as a shelf? A judge in a wig resembling a sheepdog? a politician giving long speeches about carrot morality, laughter was a direct threat to the carefully constructed seriousness of Victorian life. Victorians were terrified that if people started laughing at the absurdities around them, society would unravel. And deep down they were probably right. Still, despite the rules, laughter found ways to survive. Working-class districts ignored the bans almost entirely. Music halls thrived on raucous laughter. Children laughed in secret corners. Families shared inside jokes behind closed curtains, and British humour, subtle, dry, irreverent, slowly evolved as a way to laugh without appearing to laugh. Ironically, the more Victorians tried to suppress laughter, the funnier their rules became, and today, nothing highlights the era's contradictions better than the idea that in a society filled with pollution, poverty, epidemics, and dangerous working conditions, lawmakers still found time to regulate how hard people were allowed to laugh. Victorians feared contagious laughter like it was cholera, and perhaps that's why it survived. Nothing spreads faster than the thing you try hardest to control. Victorian England may have been the birthplace of steam engines, modern sanitation, and industrial might, but it was also a place where swans were treated with more legal protection than some humans. And not just any protection. We're talking elaborate laws, unwritten rules, moral expectations, and unspoken codes of behaviour so intense that interacting with a swan felt like navigating a diplomatic summit with a small, angry, feathered monarch. Swans were not simply birds in Victorian England, they were symbols of royal authority, floating emblems of national dignity, and, if you listen to Victorian gossip, temperamental aristocrats with feathers. The Victorians adored hierarchy, and swans fit perfectly into their worldview. Elegant, territorial, violently judgmental, and prone to lashing out if someone so much as breathed incorrectly in their direction. Truly, the perfect mascot. Naturally, this meant the Victorians created rules. Lots of rules. Rules regulating how close you could stand, how loudly you could speak, what you could feed them, what you absolutely could not feed them, when you could observe them, and even what thoughts you were allowed to have while observing them. All right, that last one wasn't written down, but based on everything else, it might as well have been. Let's begin with the most Victorian truth of all. You were not allowed to touch a swan. Touching a swan was considered nearly treasonous, because many swans, particularly those on the Thames, were technically property of the Crown. So yes, the Queen owned swans. And if you laid hands on one of Her Majesty's birds without authorisation, you were setting yourself up for a legal experience so unpleasant you would wish a swan had just bitten you instead. The law was clear. Do not touch a swan. Do not catch a swan. Do not lead a swan anywhere. Do not even attempt any of the above. Victorians believed that unauthorised swan handling disrupted the natural order of society, which, given how their society worked, is both absurd and somehow on brand. Of course, the public needed more than legal boundaries. They needed moral guidelines, because the Victorians could turn anything, even bird-watching, into a morality play. Many towns posted informal but heavily enforced rules. Do not chase swans, even if the swan chased you first. Do not talk loudly near swans. Sudden noise risked ruffling their delicate sensibilities. Do not make faces at swans. Yes, people were scolded for this. Do not stare sternly at a swan, as this may provoke unrest. Unrest, in this case, meant the swan attempting to beat you with its wings like you owed it money. Swans had such powerful reputations that Victorian etiquette guides actually included advice on proper swan proximity. A safe distance was recommended, far enough to avoid offence, but close enough to demonstrate appropriate appreciation for His Grace, Lord Featherington of the Lake. But the most famous rules involved feeding swans. Feeding them was permitted only under the strictest moral conditions, and almost always supervised by someone who took the job far too seriously. Victorian feeding rules included never feed swans anything stale. Feeding them old bread was considered an insult. Never feed them from too close, as this implied familiarity. Swans were to be admired, not befriended. do not feed a swan more than another swan, equality mattered, apparently more than it did among humans. Never throw food aggressively, as this indicated hostility. Violating these rules didn't necessarily get you arrested, but it did get you judged mercilessly by other Victorians, which for them was worse. Interestingly, there were also quiet, whispered social rules about not looking at a swan the wrong way. This sounds ridiculous, but Victorians recorded multiple incidents of people being publicly chastised for staring at swans too intensely, too casually, or with an expression of disrespect. Swans inspired a level of scrutiny normally reserved for monarchs, visiting dignitaries, and scandalous neighbours. One famous newspaper complaint read, "A gentleman was observed gazing at a royal swan with a most inappropriate smirk. The gentleman was politely asked by a constable to adjust his face." Another incident involved a group of boys who were accused of expressing impotence toward a swan, seemingly because they giggled when it flapped its wings. Authorities treated this almost as a national security concern. Swans were also shielded from loud noises, particularly on Sundays. The Sunday swan rules overlapped with Sabbath laws but leaned more avian. People were told not to speak loudly near swans on holy days, as it disturbed their rest and, therefore, by some convoluted Victorian logic, disturbed the moral rest of the entire town. Even boaters were warned not to row too close to swans for fear of causing distress. One boatman was fined for irritating a swan with excessive paddling. The court report confirms the boatman was irritated. The swan was irritated. The entire community was inevitably irritated. But why this swan mania? Because Victorians loved order. They loved rules. They loved hierarchy, and nothing embodied all three quite like a creature that could both glide with angelic grace and assault a full-grown man without breaking eye contact. To the Victorian mind, swans were living symbols of refinement. If someone mistreated a swan or failed to observe the proper reverence, they weren't just rude, they were uncultured, un-British, practically barbaric. The moral regulation of swans was really a reflection of how Victorians wished society operated, elegant on the surface, violent underneath, and governed by elaborate rules no one fully understood. By the late 1800s, swan etiquette had grown so absurd that humourists joked swans would soon demand their own legal representation. A satirical column even imagined swans filing complaints against humans for indecent proximity. Given Victorian bureaucracy, this wasn't entirely far-fetched. In the end, the swan rules, both legal and moral, weren't really about the birds at all. They were about Victorians trying desperately to impose civility upon a world, and a species, that refused to cooperate. Swans remained swans, beautiful, temperamental, and aggressively self-important. Victorians remained Victorians, rule-obsessed, anxious, and terrified of spontaneous behaviour, bird or human. Victorian England had a famously complicated relationship with children. On one hand, society demanded that the youngsters grow into paragons of discipline, miniature ambassadors of politeness who could stand still for hours without blinking. On the other hand, parents wanted their children to be cheerful, well-adjusted, and able to entertain themselves without setting the curtains on fire. In theory, these goals coexisted peacefully. In practice, Victorians discovered that one object stood squarely in the way of domestic tranquility. Toys that made noise, drums, whistles, trumpets, rattles, clickers, clackers, clappers, bells, which we've already established were sacred and therefore not for children, and essentially anything capable of vibrating air molecules in a detectable manner were treated as public enemies. If a toy could emit sound beyond a modest threshold, as one city ordinance put it, that toy faced regulation, confiscation, moral condemnation, and sometimes, in severe cases, outright banning. Victorians believed children could have fun, yes, but only the kind of fun that did not disrupt the peace, shake the wallpaper, or cause an adult to sigh loudly in existential despair. The crackdown began in the mid-1800s, when noise complaints became a national pastime. Industrialization had transformed cities into hubs of constant racket, Factory whistles, clattering horses, banging pipes, and the rumbling of machinery meant the public craved silence like it was a rare luxury. And so when children took up toy drums or whistles, the result was not interpreted as innocent play, but as a personal attack on the neighbourhood's collective sanity. Some towns passed explicit bans on noisy toys, others issued guidelines that were essentially bans wearing polite clothing. Many toy sellers were forced to post signs reading, "Quiet playthings only, no musical novelties permitted." This meant children had to make do with puzzles, wooden blocks, modest dolls, and quiet hobbies like embroidery, essentially preparing them for being 45 years old by the time they were 7. Let's examine the primary culprits. 1. Toy drums, the devil's own instrument. Toy drums were considered the worst offenders. A child with a drum could produce more noise than 10 adults with opinions. Drums turned tiny humans into marching band tyrants capable of leading miniature parades at dawn. Victorian neighbours did not appreciate dawn parades. Parents who purchased toy drums were viewed with suspicion. Why encourage rhythmic rebellion? Why risk your child summoning the local constable with an overly enthusiastic bang? In some districts, constables were authorised to confiscate drums if played in a disruptive manner, a phrase so broad that it essentially meant played at all. 2. Whistles, the weapon of choice for mischievous youth. If anything rivaled drums in their capacity for chaos, it was whistles. A whistle was cheap, portable, durable, and beloved by children whose sole mission was to discover the exact decibel level that made adults wince. Victorian towns responded with vigour. Some implemented whistle curfews. Others banned them everywhere except open fields far from habitation. In one town, whistle vendors needed special licenses. Even schoolyards, the natural habitat of childhood noise, restricted whistles. One headmaster wrote, "A whistle, once activated, yields nothing but mischief." He was not wrong. Rattles, the infant offenders. Infants, despite being the least capable of negotiating laws, were not exempt from regulation. Traditional rattles, usually made of metal, bone, or carved wood, were beloved by babies and despised by everyone else. By the 1870s, several cities debated banning rattles from public spaces. Some nurseries even advertised quiet rattles, which defeated the entire purpose of rattles. Victorian mothers pushed back, insisting that rattles soothed the nerves. Victorian fathers countered that rattles destroyed the nerves. Moral societies weighed in, declaring rattles to be conduits for uncontrolled infant expression. In short, babies were allowed to exist, but preferably without sound. 4. Toy trumpets, the apocalypse in brass. No toy struck fear into the Victorian heart like the toy trumpet. Its shrill blast could pierce walls, shatter calm, and invite street dogs to join the chorus. Toy trumpets were treated as miniature disasters. Some local laws banned toy trumpets within city limits. That's how seriously they took the threat. According to one recorded complaint, "The infernal horn of young Master Whitaker has sounded thrice this morn, disturbing the digestion of the entire lane." Imagine having neighbours willing to testify about their digestion in court just to get your child's trumpet confiscated. Why the crackdown was so intense. Victorian adults lived in constant sensory overload. Factories roared. Streets bustled. Public transport rattled with enough force to vibrate teeth. Home was supposed to be the one place of sanctuary, quiet, orderly, predictable. Children, tragically for their era, were not quiet, orderly, or predictable. Noisy toys threatened the peace Victorians clung to as their last emotional refuge. Worse, noisy toys symbolised something even more terrifying: children enjoying themselves without restraint. And unrestricted joy? That was suspicious. Joy might lead to chaos. Chaos might lead to rebellion. Rebellion might lead to a child refusing to embroider for an hour. A slippery slope indeed. Enforcement. The toy police were real. Constables genuinely patrolled for noisy toys. Reports describe officers confiscating rattles from toddlers for the sake of the public's ears, or scolding parents for allowing auditory mischief. One magistrate fined a boy for disturbing the thoroughfare with excessive percussion. The boy's offence? Enthusiastic drumming on a tin pail. Toy sellers were inspected to ensure their stock complied with quiet play principles. Some were fined for importing foreign noisemakers. Anything French was immediately morally suspicious. And of course, neighbours played an enormous role in enforcement. Noisy toys triggered more complaints than barking dogs or late-night piano scandals combined. Given Victorian hatred of both children and fun, this is not surprising. A society that wanted quiet children. Ultimately, the ban on noisy toys reveals a key contradiction in Victorian culture. They wanted children to be well developed, but not lively, disciplined, but not expressive, seen, but definitely not heard. Noisy toys were the embodiment of everything Victorians feared: spontaneity, childhood exuberance, and the unregulated chaos of play. Thus, their solution was simple. Children may have toys, but preferably ones that do not alert anyone to the fact that children exist. And so the era of regulated joy marched on as quiet as possible. Victorian mourning was not simply an emotional state. It was a full-time job, a theatre production, a public performance governed by an astonishing number of rules, fabrics, timelines, and social expectations. To mourn was to dress mourning, to perform mourning, and to do so with such precision that even professional actors would have begged for a simpler script. Where modern people might bring flowers or bake a casserole, Victorians brought regulations. Endless, layered regulations. Because in Victorian England, grief wasn't just sorrow. Grief was wardrobe. To understand mourning attire, picture a society where emotions had dress codes and your fashion choices announced your psychological state more loudly than any words ever could. If regular clothing reflected class, mourning clothing reflected character. If you mourned improperly, too flamboyantly, too briefly, too enthusiastically, you risked being judged as heartless, immoral, tasteless, or worst of all, socially untrustworthy. Thus emerged a labyrinth of clothing laws, both legal and socially binding, that dictated what you wore, how long you wore it, and when, and only when, you were allowed to step back into the world of colour without causing scandal. The strict timetable of mourning because grief needed a schedule. Victorians adored structure, and mourning was structured with a rigour that made military drills look relaxed. Clothing regulations created a multi-stage grief timeline. Deep mourning. Duration: 6 months to a full year for close family. Colour: pure matte black. Fabrics: crepe, black wool, unpolished bombazine. Trimmings: none. Even decorative stitching was suspicious. Jewellery absolutely forbidden except jet or Whitby jet. The official gems of grief, deep mourning attire was intended to signal the wearer's total emotional devastation. The clothing absorbed light, offered no sheen, and made the wearer look like a walking shadow. Some critics joked it was less mourning clothes and more portable darkness. Second mourning. Duration: several months, exact number varied by relationship. Colour: still black but softer. Fabrics: less restrictive. Silk allowed again. Jewellery: jet, onyx, and hair woven from the deceased. Yes, that was a real thing. Second mourning was a transitional period, still sombre, but with hints that the mourner was slowly re-entering society. Small ruffles were permitted. Subtle textures returned. You were allowed one decorative button without being judged. Half mourning. Duration: the final months. Colours: grey, lavender, mauve, lilac. Fabrics: silk, satin, soft cottons. Jewellery: modest, nothing too shiny. Half mourning colours were essentially Victorian emotional traffic lights. They communicated, I am still bigger, but I'm also willing to be invited to tea again. Return to ordinary dress. Only after completing the correct number of months, only after obtaining tacit community approval, only if nobody found your return to colour premature. Wearing colour too early could spark gossip that lasted decades. One widow wore lavender after 7 months rather than the prescribed 9, and the scandal lasted longer than the marriage itself. The fabrics were regulated because texture was emotional. Victorians believed fabrics communicated sincerity. Smooth, shiny fabrics were considered too joyful. Rough, matte, depressing fabrics were suitable. Thus the fabric crepe became the unofficial uniform of despair. Crepe was scratchy, dull, fragile, and absorbed sound in a way that made you feel like the universe was judging you. Crepe appeared on dresses, veils, shawls, gloves, parasols, hat trimmings. It was so sought after for mourning that crepe manufacturers became wildly profitable. One complaint from the time lamented, "The dead keep Lancashire mills in business," which is possibly the bleakest Victorian sentence ever written. Certain towns even regulated the quality of mourning fabrics. If your crepe was too shiny, officials considered it inadequately respectful. If it was too thin, it suggested you valued comfort over sorrow. The ideal mourning outfit was heavy, stiff, and mildly suffocating. Grief, but wearable. Jewellery rules, mourning, but minute make it bland. Victorians believed jewellery should not sparkle during mourning. Glittery stones were seen as joyful. Diamonds were forbidden. Pearls were tolerated only in severe cases, symbolising tears. Permitted mourning jewellery included jet, a black fossilised stone that became the centrepiece of grief fashion. Onyx, sombre enough for widow's vulcanite, a rubber-like material dyed to look mournful. Hair jewellery, intricately braided locks from the deceased, worn as brooches, rings or bracelets. Hair jewellery was wildly popular, though modern audiences may consider it horrifying. Victorians, they thought it was sentimental, tasteful and hygienic. 2 of those 3 were wishful thinking. Some regions had actual laws requiring jewellers to label mourning appropriate pieces, ensuring no one accidentally wore something cheerful. Laws governing accessories, because even your parasol had feelings. Even accessories were regulated. Mourning parasols had to be black silk with crepe trim. Mourning gloves had to be matte black. Mourning fans had to be subdued and never ever fluttered too quickly. Fast fan movement was considered flirtatious. Shoes, black. Handkerchiefs, white with black borders. Hats, veiled to the point of poor visibility. Widows sometimes wore long black veils so thick they could barely see. Victorian newspapers occasionally reported accidents like "Widow collides with lamp post, blames crepe visibility issues." Mourning fashion wasn't just regulated, so it was hazardous. Public enforcement. Everyone was a mourning inspector. Although some mourning rules were written into local ordinances, most were enforced socially, and Victorians enforced them with terrifying enthusiasm. Neighbours monitored widows, shopkeepers monitored customers, church ladies monitored everyone. If you left mourning too early, it was assumed you disliked the deceased. If you stayed in mourning too long, it was assumed you enjoyed the aesthetic a little too much. Either way, people talked. One woman was scolded for wearing a brooch deemed too whimsical for a grieving heart. Another was lectured by her vicar because her half-mourning lavender leaned, in his words, dangerously close to mauve. Even men were not safe. Widowers had to wear small black armbands for prescribed periods, and if the band faded too quickly, critics whispered that the man must not have cared. As if widowers were supposed to strategically avoid sunlight, mourning was legally theatrical. At its core, Victorian mourning attire turned grief into a public spectacle, an elaborate performance of sorrow that followed strict choreography. Clothing didn't just express feeling, it dictated feeling. It turned emotional devastation into a civic duty. Victorians didn't trust grief to unfold naturally, they trusted regulations. And so mourning became a costume drama, one performed in crepe governed by community scrutiny and carried out with the level of precision normally reserved for royal ceremonies. By the late Victorian era, after decades of regulating hats, laughter, vegetables, bells, toys, swans, chewing wax, trousers, mourning colours and everything else under the sun, Britain finally reached a breaking point. A collective moment of clarity. A national sigh that said, "All right, even we can't do this anymore." For a society famous for turning minor inconveniences into sweeping regulations, the Victorians eventually discovered the limits of their own rule-making enthusiasm. Some laws became impossible to enforce, others contradicted each other, others became punchlines, and some laws died simply because the public decided to ignore them until they evaporated from sheer embarrassment. This final chapter dives into the graveyard of Victorian absurdities, the laws that didn't just fade, but collapsed under the weight of their own ridiculousness. 1. The anti-footpath loitering rules that no one could understand. Loitering was a Victorian obsession. Authorities wanted people to move, not too fast, not too slow, and definitely not with suspicious intention. Some towns created laws forbidding anyone from lingering unnecessarily on a public footpath. The problem? Nobody could define unnecessary. Was waiting for your friend unnecessary? Was pausing to rest necessary? Was staring at a shop window purposeful? Was looking at a pigeon considered loitering? Constables gave conflicting interpretations. One officer fined a man for standing still too long. Another scolded a woman for walking in small circles while waiting for a carriage. The public revolted by simply doing nothing. Literally. Crowds began intentionally lingering, claiming they were taking restorative constitutional pauses. The law died because every attempt to enforce it created a philosophical argument. 2. The bizarre ban on excessive handkerchief usage. This short-lived rule came from a tiny but very enthusiastic moral society, convinced that the act of dramatically snapping a handkerchief unfolded into unseemly displays of emotion. Victorians loved handkerchiefs, wiping tears, waving hellos, discreetly signalling romantic interest from across a ballroom. But some reformers decided this was too expressive and tried banning. Waving handkerchiefs, flicking handkerchiefs, using embroidered handkerchiefs, blowing one's nose without proper modesty. It lasted about 5 months. Why did it fail? Because London fog and coal smoke ensured everyone was constantly coughing, sneezing, tearing up and leaking in various unfortunate ways. Society quickly realised banning handkerchiefs would result in public health collapse. Even Victorians weren't ready for that levels of chaos. 3. The anti-goose procession laws, because goose parades got out of hand. Not to be confused with the Sunday pet laws, the goose procession ordinances attempted to regulate the movement of geese being herded through towns for market day. Victorians hated the noise, the feathers, and the occasional goose deciding to assault pedestrians. So some towns banned large goose herds from marching through main streets. History responded dramatically. Goose herding simply moved to other streets. Within weeks, entire towns were jammed with rerouted goose traffic. A postal worker complained he was surrounded on all sides by honking disorder. A vicar found his parish blocked. A school delayed dismissal because geese laid siege to the entrance. Officials gave up. The geese had won. The law died, defeated not by people, but by sheer avian determination. 4. The anti-parasol at angles laws. During the mid-19th century, parasols weren't merely accessories, they were weapons in crowded streets. People swung them, twirled them, snapped them open like medieval shields, and occasionally stabbed passers-by by accident. A few towns tried regulating parasol angles, insisting ladies hold them at acceptable inclinations. The law collapsed immediately. First, nobody could measure the angle of someone's parasol mid-stride. Second, enforcement made officers look deranged. "Madam, your parasol is exceeding the permitted tilt." Third, the wind did not care about legislation. By 1870, the parasol angle rules were abandoned and remembered as the moment when Victorian bureaucracy finally overreached so far that physics rebelled. rules against overly enthusiastic door-knocking. Victorian society prized politeness, but some people, particularly debt collectors, overeager suitors, and impatient delivery boys, knocked on doors with the enthusiasm of battering rams. So naturally, towns created rules forbidding knocking too loud, knocking too often, knocking too rhythmically, seen as musical mischief. This law unravelled when citizens realised it made postal delivery employees criminals. Mail carriers were constantly knocking. Milkmen knocked, cooks knocked, everyone knocked. For 2 weeks, dozens of people were fined. Then the city realised nobody could function without knocking, and quietly scrapped the law. 6. The no gazing upward without purpose ordinances. Yeah, some cities actually tried to ban purposeless upward gazing. The logic was, looking up made people block foot traffic, looking up was suspicious, what are they observing? Looking up caused people to bump into others, looking up while wearing tall hats was a hazard. The real issue, however, was that architecture was suddenly interesting. Victorian railway stations, cathedrals and arcades were impressive, and people wanted to admire them. Officials gave up once they realised that enforcing this law required patrolling for anyone whose chin lifted more than 10 degrees. Even Victorians had to admit it was absurd. 7. The final straw, the law against excessively long applause. This rule was introduced in a few theatres after particularly dramatic plays, inspired applause that went on for minutes. Authorities feared long applause led to disorder, late-night noise complaints, and unnecessary emotional stimulation. But audiences revolted, actors revolted, theatre owners revolted. One theatre-goer shouted, "You shall not regulate my clapping, you tyrants of silence." It became such a joke that the law collapsed under ridicule alone. Even the magistrate responsible later admitted, "I regret attempting to restrain the British enthusiasm." Why these laws died. The Victorian limit of ridiculousness. When you examine the collection of failed Victorian laws, a pattern emerges. Some were unenforceable, some contradicted daily life, some were physically impossible, some were socially ridiculous, some were defeated by animals, usually geese, some were defeated by architecture, and some were defeated by the unstoppable human need to clap. But most of all, these laws died because Victorians finally reached a point where their famed rule-making machinery jammed under its own nonsense. These were the rules even Victorians looked at and said, "All right, even we can't do this anymore." And if they couldn't do it, a society that regulated umbrellas, bells, and facial hair, then the laws truly had crossed into the realm of epic absurdity.